Some of us know what it feels like to swallow our pride for the sake of our children. Some of us understand the weight of standing at a stranger's door, hat in hand, asking for just one chance to prove our worth. Ben Walker had knocked on dozens of doors that week, each rejection cutting deeper than the last. The single father stood at the gates of the Langston estate with his final notice from the bank crumpled in his truck. When Genevieve Langston opened her door, Ben's rehearsed speech nearly died in his throat. "I'll work for free," he said. "Just give me a chance." The wealthy woman studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Something flickered across her face, recognition, or hope she'd thought long buried. "You're the man I've been looking for," she said quietly. But what was she really looking for in a desperate stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel driveway as Ben Walker's pickup truck coughed to life one more time. He sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his nerves before facing whatever lay ahead at the Langston estate. Through his rearview mirror, he could see the small silver trailer that had been home for him and his 8-year-old son, Tommy, for the past 3 years. It wasn't Moocher double-wide with peeling paint and a front step that wobbled when you put your full weight on it, but it was theirs. Well, it had been theirs until the factory closed. Ben rubbed his calloused fingers over Tommy's medical bracelet, which he always kept in his shirt pocket during the day. The worn piece of medical alert jewelry had become his talisman, a constant reminder of why he couldn't afford to fail. Tommy needed stability, routine, and most importantly, his specialized therapy sessions that cost more per month than most people made. The boy was still sleeping when Ben left that morning, curled up with his favorite weighted blanket and the stuffed elephant that went everywhere with him. Mrs. Chen from next door would be over soon to get Tommy ready for his day program. She'd been a godsend these past few weeks, refusing to accept payment for watching Tommy while Ben searched for work. "You're a good father, Ben," she'd told him just yesterday, her weathered hands patting his shoulder. "That boy knows he's loved. That's worth more than money." But love didn't pay for rent, and it certainly didn't cover the stack of medical bills that seemed to grow thicker each day. Ben had been a furniture maker for 15 years, working his way up from apprentice to lead craftsman at Morrison's Fine Furniture. He could make a dining room table sing with the grain of the wood, could craft a rocking chair that would last 3 generations. His hands knew the feel of maple and oak, cherry and walnut. They knew the precise pressure needed to guide a handplane, the delicate touch required for final sanding. Those same hands now trembled slightly as he turned off the engine and stepped out into the crisp October air. The Langston estate spread before him like something from a magazine, manicured lawns that seemed to roll on forever, ancient oak trees that must have witnessed 100 seasons, and in the center of it all, a house that belonged in a different century. The main residence was a masterpiece of colonial architecture, all white columns and black shutters, with ivy climbing the brick in perfectly controlled patterns. Ben had heard about Genevieve Langston around town. Everyone had. She was something of a local legend, the tech entrepreneur, who'd sold her software company for more money than most people could comprehend, then moved to their small Virginia town and purchased the old Henderson estate. Some said she was running from something in the city. Others whispered that she was just another rich, eccentric looking to play at country living. What everyone agreed on was that she kept to herself. Ben straightened his shoulders and walked up the curved stone path. His work boots resoled twice, but still solid made soft, crunching sounds on the fallen leaves. He'd worn his best flannel shirt, the blue one that Tommy said made his eyes look like the sky when it's happy. His jeans were clean, his hair combed back, but he still felt like he was wearing a costume to a play where he didn't know his lines. The front door was solid mahogany with brass fixtures that probably cost more than Ben made in a month back when he was making anything at all. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What exactly was he going to say? How do you ask a stranger for work when you have nothing to offer but desperation and a willingness to try? Before he could second-guess himself further, the door opened. Genevieve Langston was not what he'd expected. He'd imagined someone older, perhaps stern and forbidding. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman who couldn't be much older than his own 35 years. She had auburn hair that caught the morning light and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything about him in a single glance. She was beautiful in the way that money allowed, polished, put together, wearing clothes that fit perfectly and probably cost more than Ben's truck. But there was something else there, something that money couldn't buy or hide. A sadness that lived behind her eyes, a careful distance that spoke of someone who'd learned to protect herself from the world. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cultured, careful, not unfriendly but not welcoming either. Ben cleared his throat. "Ma'am, my name is Ben Walker. I was a furniture maker over at Morrison's before they closed down. I heard you might be doing some renovations, and I was wondering if you might need some help." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "What kind of help?" "Anything you need. Carpentry, painting, yard work, repairs. I'm good with my hands, and I'm reliable. I know this might sound strange, but I'll work for free at first. Just give me a chance to show you what I can do." The words hung in the air between them. Ben felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd never begged for anything in his life, but here he was, hat in hand, asking this stranger to take a chance on him. Genevieve's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. She looked at him more carefully now, taking in his worn but clean clothes, his calloused hands, the way he stood straight, despite the obvious difficulty of the moment. "Why?" she asked simply. Ben thought about lying, about crafting some story that would make him sound more dignified. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "I have a son. He's 8, and he has autism. He needs his therapy, his routine. We're about to lose our home, and I can't let that happen to him. He's already lost too much." The silence stretched between them. A cardinal landed on the porch railing, bright red against the white columns, then flew away again. "You're the man I've been looking for," Genevieve said quietly. Ben blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Ma'am?" "I have a project," she continued, her voice taking on a businesslike tone. "A guest house that needs to be restored. It's been sitting unfinished for 2 years. I've had contractors look at it, but none of them understood what I wanted." She stepped back from the door, gesturing for him to follow. "Come, let me show you." Ben fell into step beside her as they walked around the main house. The grounds were even more impressive up, close everything carefully maintained, but with a naturalness that spoke of someone who understood that beauty shouldn't look forced. "I bought this property 3 years ago," Genevieve said as they walked. The main house was in good condition, but there were several outbuildings that needed work. I had most of them renovated right away, but the guest house— She paused, her step faltering slightly. The guest house was a special project. They rounded a corner, and Ben saw it. The structure was solid, a smaller version of the main house's colonial style, but it was clearly unfinished. Windows stood empty of glass, the front porch lacked railings, and scaffolding surrounded one side where work had obviously stopped mid-project. "It was going to be an art studio," Genevieve said, her voice softer now. "My husband was a painter, not professionally, just for pleasure, but he was quite talented. He had such plans for this space." The past tense wasn't lost on Ben. "Was?" "He died 2 years ago. Car accident." The words came out flat, matter of fact, but Ben could hear the carefully controlled emotion underneath. "I hired contractors to finish the work, but they didn't understand his vision. They wanted to make it practical, efficient. They didn't understand that some things are more important than practicality." Ben nodded slowly, looking at the building with new eyes. He could see the potential in the structure, the careful attention to proportions and details that spoke of someone who cared about more than just function. "What would you want me to do?" he asked. "Finish it," she said simply, the way he would have wanted it finished. Ben walked closer to the building, running his hands along the exposed framing. The work that had been done was solid, professional. Someone had started with care and attention to detail. "I'd need to see his plans," Ben said. "Understand what he was envisioning. I have everything. Sketches, notes, even samples of materials he'd chosen. Genevieve's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I just need someone who can see beyond the obvious. Someone who understands that a building can be more than just wood and nails. Ben turned to face her. Mrs. Langston, I appreciate the opportunity, but I should be clear about something. I'm not a charity case. I may be down on my luck right now, but I do good work. If you hire me, it'll be because I can do the job right, not because you feel sorry for me. Something changed in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or respect. Fair enough, Mr. Walker, but I should be equally clear. This isn't a charity project for me either. This matters. This matters more than you can possibly understand right now. They stood there for a moment, sizing each other up. Two people who'd been knocked down by life in different ways, trying to figure out if they could trust each other with something fragile and important. When would you want to start? Ben asked. Tomorrow, if you're available, we can discuss wages. Let me work for a week first, Ben interrupted. Let me show you what I can do. If you're satisfied, then we'll talk about payment. Genevieve studied him for a long moment. You're not what I expected. Neither are you, Ben replied honestly. A small smile crossed her face, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. I think this might work out, Mr. Walker. As Ben drove home that afternoon, Tommy's medical bracelet still warm in his pocket, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind that had driven him to knock on door after door, but something steadier, something that felt like it might last. He found Tommy in the living room with Mrs. Chen, working on a puzzle of farm animals. The boy looked up when his father entered, his face lighting up with the pure joy that never failed to make Ben's heart ache with love. Daddy, look, I found all the horses. Ben knelt down beside his son, examining the puzzle pieces, arranged with Tommy's characteristic precision. That's wonderful, buddy. You've been busy. Mrs. Chen gathered her things, patting Ben's shoulder as she passed. Good day? She asked quietly. I think so, Ben replied. I think it might have been a very good day. After she left, Ben sat with Tommy on the couch, watching as his son carefully placed the remaining puzzle pieces. The late afternoon light streamed through their small windows, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air. Their trailer might not be much, but it was filled with love and laughter and the kind of contentment that couldn't be bought. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of restoring someone else's dreams. Tonight, he would hold his own dreams close and allow himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were both going to be all right. Tommy finished the puzzle and looked up at his father with eyes that held all the trust in the world. Daddy, are you happy? Ben smoothed his son's hair, feeling the weight of responsibility and love settle around his shoulders like a familiar coat. Yeah, buddy, I think I am. Ben arrived at the Langston estate the next morning with his toolbox in the back of his truck and a thermos of coffee that Mrs. Chen had pressed into his hands. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the morning light painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Genevieve met him at the guest house, dressed in dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than Ben's monthly grocery budget. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm and wore the same carefully composed expression he'd seen the day before. I brought everything, she said, opening the portfolio. Marcus's sketches, his notes, material samples, everything he planned for this space. She handed him a folder, and Ben opened it carefully. The first thing he saw was a hand-drawn blueprint, water-stained around the edges, but still clear enough to read. The drawing showed the guest house layout with meticulous detail, not just the structural elements, but notes about natural light, views of the garden, the precise placement of easels and storage for art supplies. He was thorough, Ben said, impressed by the attention to detail. He was a perfectionist, Genevieve replied, about everything that mattered to him. Ben studied the sketches, noting the way Marcus had planned for the morning light to flood the main studio space, how he'd positioned windows to frame specific views of the estate grounds. This wasn't just a room, it was a sanctuary designed for creativity and contemplation. This is beautiful work, Ben said honestly. I can see why you want it finished properly. Genevieve nodded, but something flickered across her face, pain, perhaps, or regret. He spent months planning it. Every detail had meaning. Ben spent the morning examining the existing structure, comparing it to Marcus's plans. The foundation work was solid, the framing expertly done. Someone had started this project with real skill and attention to detail. As he worked, he became aware of Genevieve watching him from a distance, her arms wrapped around herself despite the mild weather. Around noon, Ben climbed down from the scaffolding, where he'd been examining the unfinished roof line. He found Genevieve sitting on the stone steps of the main house, staring at the guest house, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Everything looks good structurally," he reported. "Whoever started this knew what they were doing. The electrical rough is properly done, plumbing's in place. It's really just a matter of finishing work windows, flooring, trim, paint." "Marcus started it himself," she said quietly. "He wasn't a professional, but he was handy. Said he wanted to build his studio with his own hands." She paused, her fingers absently turning a thin gold chain around her neck. "He got the framework up, did most of the rough work. Then She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Ben sat down beside her on the steps, maintaining a respectful distance. "How long were you married?" 8 years. We met in college, got married right after graduation. He was getting his MBA while I was building my first software company." A small smile crossed her face. "He used to joke that he was married to a workaholic who spoke in code. Was he right?" "Completely." The smile faded. "I thought we had all the time in the world to slow down, to enjoy the life we were building. I kept saying next year or after this project. Marcus was the one who convinced me to buy this place, said we needed somewhere to remember what really mattered." Ben nodded, understanding the weight of regret in her voice. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was, and patient, probably too patient with me." She stood up abruptly. "I should let you get back to work. I have some calls to make." But as she turned to go, something made Ben call after her. "Mrs. Langston, would it be all right if I looked at more of his things, his tools, maybe some of his paintings? It might help me understand what he was trying to create here." She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she nodded. "His workshop is in the basement of the main house. I'll show you." The basement workshop was a revelation. Marcus Langston had been a man who appreciated quality and craftsmanship. His tools were organized with military precision hand planes, arranged by size, chisels, sharp and clean, measuring tools that looked like they'd been cared for, like family heirlooms. But there was dust on everything, the kind of dust that accumulates when a space has been abandoned. "He spent hours down here," Genevieve said, her voice echoing slightly in the space. "Even after long days at his corporate job, he'd come down here to work with his hands, said it kept him grounded." Ben ran his fingers along a workbench that had been worn smooth by years of use. He could see the marks of a craftsman who'd truly loved his work, careful notches for measurements, stains from various finishes, the gentle wear patterns that spoke of countless hours spent creating. "Would you mind if I used some of his tools?" Ben asked. "I have my own, but they were chosen for this project. It seems right." Genevieve's breath caught, and Ben turned to see tears glistening in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. It was then that Ben noticed the paintings. They were stacked against the far wall, maybe 20 canvases of various sizes. Most were landscapes views of the estate grounds in different seasons, studies of light and shadow that showed real talent and a deep love of the place. But it was the unfinished canvas on the easel that made Ben's chest tighten. The painting showed the guest house as Marcus had envisioned it when complete. The building glowed with warm light from within, surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Through the large windows, you could just make out the suggestion of an artist at work, brush in hand, captured in a moment of pure creative joy. "He was painting his dream," Ben said softly. Genevieve moved to stand beside him, and Ben noticed she was wearing the gold chain outside her sweater now. Hanging from it was a wedding ring, not her own, but a man's ring, worn with age and obviously precious beyond measure. "He started that painting the week before he died," she whispered. "I found him here that last morning, working on it before he left for his meeting in Richmond. He said he wanted to finish it as a surprise for me, to show me what the guest house would look like when it was done." The silence in the workshop felt heavy with grief and unfinished dreams. Ben understood now why the guest house had sat unfinished for 2 years, why Genevieve had been unable to let contractors complete the work. This wasn't just a building, it was a love letter left unfinished. "I keep thinking I should donate his art supplies," Genevieve continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone else could use them, but I can't seem to. I can't let go." Ben studied the unfinished painting, seeing not just Marcus's vision, but the love that had inspired it. The guest house in the painting wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of the life he and Genevieve had planned together, a place where creativity and love could flourish. "Maybe," Ben said carefully, "the goal isn't to let go. Maybe it's to find a way to honor what he started, while still allowing something new to grow." Genevieve turned to look at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "What do you mean?" "Finish the guest house the way he planned it, yes, but don't preserve it as a museum. Let it be what he wanted it to, be a place where art happens, where creativity lives. Maybe that's the best way to honor his memory." She was quiet for a long time, her fingers turning the ring on its chain. Finally, she nodded. "You understand," she said simply. "You understand what this means." Ben looked around the workshop one more time, taking in the careful organization, the quality tools, the paintings that spoke of a man who'd found joy in creating beauty. "I think I'm beginning to." As they climbed the stairs back to the main floor, Genevieve paused. "Mr. Walker-Benny wants you to know that this project, finishing Marcus's studio, it's not just about the building. It's about," she struggled for the words, "it's about whether I can find a way to live again instead of just existing." Ben nodded, understanding the weight of what she was entrusting to him. "Then we'll make sure we get it right." That evening, as Ben drove home to Tommy and their small trailer, he found himself thinking about unfinished dreams and the courage it takes to continue someone else's vision. In his shirt pocket, Tommy's medical bracelet seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat, reminding him that he too had dreams worth fighting for. The guest house project was no longer just a job, it was a sacred trust, a chance to help someone heal while proving that he was worthy of the faith being placed in him. As he pulled into his driveway and saw Tommy's face in the window, bright with welcome, Ben knew that tomorrow would bring more than just construction work. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate task of finishing what love had started. The next morning, Ben arrived at the estate carrying Marcus's hand-drawn blueprint in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the October drizzle. The water-stained paper had become his roadmap, each faded line and careful notation a glimpse into another man's vision. He'd spent the previous evening studying every detail, making notes in his own careful handwriting about materials and measurements. Genevieve was waiting by the guest house when he arrived, holding 2 steaming coffee mugs. She handed him one without a word, black, the way he'd mentioned he liked it the day before. It was a small gesture, but it spoke of someone who paid attention to details. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, watching as Ben spread the blueprint on the makeshift work table he'd set up, "about honoring what Marcus started while letting something new grow." Ben looked up from the plans. "And I want to be involved, not just as someone who signs, checks, and approves decisions. I want to learn, to understand what he was trying to create here." She paused, uncertainty flickering across her face. "If that's all right with you." Ben smiled. "Mrs. Langston, this was his dream. Having you involved in bringing it to life, I think he'd like that very much." They spent the morning going through Marcus's detailed notes together. The man had been meticulous in his planning, noting everything from the angle of natural light at different times of day to the specific type of wood stain he wanted for the interior trim. But more than the technical specifications, his notes revealed his emotional connection to the project. He writes here about wanting the studio to feel like a sanctuary where creativity can flourish without judgment, Ben read aloud. And look at this note, windows positioned to frame the oak tree where Jen likes to read in the afternoons. Genevieve's breath caught. I didn't know he'd noticed that. He noticed everything about you, Ben said gently. These plans aren't just about building a studio, they're about building a space specifically for the woman he loved. As they worked through the morning, Ben began to see the careful thought behind every decision Marcus had made. The placement of electrical outlets wasn't random, they were positioned to accommodate easels and task lighting in optimal configurations. The storage areas weren't just functional, they were designed to keep art supplies organized, but easily accessible. Even the choice of flooring had been considered from an artist's perspective, selecting materials that would be comfortable to stand on for long periods, but durable enough to withstand paint spills and heavy equipment. Your husband was a thoughtful man, Ben observed as he measured the space where Marcus had planned built-in storage cabinets. Sometimes I think he knew me better than I knew myself, Genevieve replied. She was sitting on an overturned bucket, reading through a stack of Marcus's notes. Listen to this. Jen always says she's not artistic, but I've seen the way she arranges flowers, the way she chooses colors for the house. She has an artist's eye. She just needs the right space to discover it. Ben paused in his measuring. Do you think he was right? I don't know. I've always been focused on practical things, business, technology, solving problems with logic and data. Art seemed like something for other people who had time for beauty and creativity. Maybe that's exactly why he wanted to build this for you, Ben suggested, to give you permission to explore that side of yourself. The sound of a car door slamming interrupted their conversation. Through the unfinished windows, they could see a small blue sedan parked near the main house. A moment later, Mrs. Chen appeared, leading Tommy by the hand. I hope it's all right, the elderly woman called out. Tommy's day program was cancelled because of a stomach bug going around, and he kept asking about seeing where Daddy works. Ben set down his tape measure and walked over to greet his son. Tommy looked around with wide eyes, taking in the skeletal structure of the guest house with the intense focus he brought to anything new and interesting. Daddy, what are you building? Tommy asked, his voice carrying the precise diction that came from years of speech therapy. I'm helping to finish an art studio, Ben explained, kneeling down to Tommy's level. Remember how you like to draw pictures? This is going to be a special place where someone can make really big pictures. Tommy nodded solemnly, then walked over to where Genevieve was sitting. He studied her with the same intensity he'd given the building. Are you the lady who owns the big house? He asked. I am, Genevieve replied, and Ben was touched to hear her adjust her tone to the gentle, clear way that worked best with Tommy. My name is Genevieve. You can call me Miss Jen if you'd like. Miss Jen, Tommy repeated, as if testing how the name felt. Do you like to draw pictures? I'm not very good at it, Genevieve admitted, but I'm hoping to learn. Tommy considered this seriously. Daddy says practice makes better, not perfect, because perfect is too hard, just better. Genevieve's eyes met Ben's over Tommy's head, and he saw something soft and wondering in her expression. That's very wise advice, Tommy. Mrs. Chen settled herself on the stone steps with a book, content to let Tommy explore while staying within sight. Ben returned to his work, but found himself watching as Tommy methodically examined every aspect of the construction site. The boy had a way of seeing details that others missed, and his questions, while sometimes unexpected, often revealed insights that adults overlooked. Why are there so many windows? Tommy asked, running his small hand along the frame of what would be the studio's main window. Because the person who designed this studio wanted lots of natural light, Ben explained. Light is very important for making art. Like how I need the good light to do my puzzles. Exactly like that. Genevieve watched this exchange with something approaching wonder. Ben could see her taking in the patience he showed with Tommy's questions, the way he treated his son's curiosity as valuable rather than burdensome. Tommy, she said suddenly, would you like to see the plans your father is working from? Tommy nodded eagerly, and Genevieve carefully showed him the blueprint, pointing out different areas and explaining what each space would become. Ben was struck by her natural way with his songe. He didn't talk down to him or oversimplify, but she adjusted her explanations to match his understanding. "This room will have easels for painting," she said, pointing to the main studio space. "And this smaller room will store all the art supplies, brushes and paints and different kinds of paper." "Will you paint pictures of horses?" Tommy asked hopefully. Horses were his current obsession, following a phase of intense interest in farm animals. "I might," Genevieve said seriously. "Would you like that?" "Yes. Horses are beautiful and strong, and they take care of their families." The simple observation hung in the air, and Ben saw Genevieve blink back sudden tears. Tommy had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things with his honest observations. As the afternoon wore on, Ben continued his work, while Tommy helped in the ways an 8-year-old could, sorting screws by size, holding a measuring tape steady, carefully organizing tools in Marcus's toolbox that Ben had brought up from the basement workshop. The boy's need for order and routine actually made him quite helpful, and Ben could see that Genevieve was charmed by Tommy's methodical approach to every task. "He's remarkable," she said quietly during a moment when Tommy was absorbed in arranging paintbrushes by size in Marcus's old brush holder. "He is," Ben agreed. "Different doesn't mean less. It just means he sees the world in his own way." "His mother," Genevieve began, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "It's all right," Ben said. "Sarah died when Tommy was born. Complications during delivery. It's been just the two of us from the beginning." "That must have been incredibly difficult." Ben watched his son, who was now explaining to Mrs. Chen the proper way to organize paintbrushes according to both size and type of bristle. "It was. But Tommy taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. Patience, for one thing, and how to find joy in small, perfect moments." As if sensing he was being discussed, Tommy looked up and grinned at his father. "Daddy, I organized all the brushes. Miss Jen, when you paint your horse pictures, you'll know exactly which brush to use." "Thank you, Tommy," Genevieve said, her voice slightly husky. "I think you're going to be a very good helper for this project." Later, as Mrs. Chen prepared to take Tommy home for dinner, the boy walked over to Genevieve with something in his small hands. "I made this for you," he said, holding out a small arrangement of fallen leaves he'd gathered and arranged by color gradation. "Daddy says when people are sad, beautiful things help them remember that the world is still good." Genevieve accepted the leaf arrangement with hands that trembled slightly. "It's beautiful, Tommy. Thank you." "You're welcome. Will you be here tomorrow, when Daddy works on your art house?" "I will." "Good. I like you, Miss Jen. You have kind eyes like Daddy." After they left, Ben and Genevieve worked in comfortable silence as the afternoon light began to fade. The guest house was starting to feel less like an abandoned project and more like a place with purpose and future. "He's lucky to have you," Genevieve said eventually. "I'm the lucky one," Ben replied. "Tommy sees the world without pretense or judgment. He reminds me every day what really matters." As they cleaned up for the day, Ben noticed Genevieve carefully placing Tommy's leaf arrangement on the windowsill of what would become the main studio. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes about the kind of person she was beneath her careful reserve. "Same time tomorrow?" Ben asked as they walked back toward the main house. "Yes," Genevieve said. "And Ben, thank you for letting Tommy be part of this. I think Marcus would have loved him." As Ben drove home that evening, he found himself thinking about the way Genevieve had looked at Tommy not with pity or discomfort, but with genuine appreciation for who he was. It had been a long time since someone outside their small circle had seen Tommy's gifts rather than his challenges. Maybe, Ben thought as he pulled into their driveway, this job was going to change more than just his financial situation. Maybe it was going to change all of their lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. Ben had been working at the estate for a week when he first opened Marcus's antique toolbox. It sat on the workbench in the basement workshop like a treasure chest, its brass fittings gleaming despite the dust that had settled on everything else. The toolbox itself was a work of art, dovetailed corners, smooth sliding drawers, and a patina that spoke of decades of careful use. Inside, Each tool had its designated place, held secure by custom-fitted compartments lined with green felt. The hand planes were pristine, their blades sharp enough to shave paper-thin curls from a piece of wood. The chisels ranged from delicate quarter-inch blades to hefty 2-inch mortising tools, all bearing the marks of quality craftsmanship. These weren't the tools of a weekend hobbyist. They belonged to someone who understood and respected the art of working with wood. He researched every purchase for months, Genevieve said, appearing at Ben's shoulder as he reverently lifted a shoulder plane from its fitted compartment. He said buying cheap tools was like trying to paint with broken brushes. Ben ran his fingers along the tool's perfectly smooth sole. He was right. These are museum pieces. I've never seen a collection this fine outside of a specialty shop. Use them, Genevieve said firmly. They're meant to be used, not admired. Marcus would be horrified to think they were sitting here gathering dust while his studio remained unfinished. Over the following days, Ben found himself developing an almost spiritual connection to Marcus's tools. Each one had been chosen with specific purpose, and as Ben worked with them, he began to understand the man who had owned them. Marcus had been methodical, patient, someone who believed that the quality of your tools reflected the respect you had for your craft. The windows were the first major milestone. Ben had found Marcus's notes about the custom casements he'd wanted not. The standard vinyl replacements that modern contractors might install, but traditional wood-framed windows that would complement the colonial architecture while providing the specific light qualities an artist needed. The supplier Marcus chose went out of business, Genevieve explained, as they reviewed the window specifications. I've called around, but no one else makes windows exactly like these. Ben studied the detailed drawings Marcus had made. What if we made them ourselves? Could we do that? With these tools and the right lumber, absolutely. It'll take longer than ordering prefab windows, but they'll be exactly what Marcus envisioned. The decision to craft the windows by hand marked a turning point in their working relationship. Genevieve began spending her mornings at the guest house, learning to use some of Marcus's simpler tools while Ben worked on the more complex joinery. She had an intuitive understanding of proportions and design that surprised them both. I never thought I had any artistic ability, she said one morning as she carefully sanded a window mullion. But there's something satisfying about creating something beautiful with your hands. Marcus saw that in you. Ben replied, planing the edge of a window rail with one of Marcus's perfectly tuned planes. His notes are full of observations about your eye for design, your appreciation for quality and beauty. They worked in comfortable companionship, the autumn sun streaming through the open frame where the first window would soon be installed. Ben found himself looking forward to these morning collaborations almost as much as the actual construction work. Genevieve had a quick mind and steady hands, and she asked thoughtful questions that helped him think through problems from new angles. Tommy had become a regular visitor to the worksite after school. His autism gave him an unusual ability to focus on detail work, and he'd appointed himself the official organizer of small parts and hardware. Ben was touched to see how naturally Genevieve included Tommy in their conversations, never talking around him or treating him as if he weren't there. "Tommy, what do you think about this joint?" she asked one afternoon, showing him where Ben had fitted a complex mortise and tenon connection. "Does it look strong enough?" Tommy examined the joint with his characteristic intensity. "It looks like puzzle pieces that fit perfectly," he pronounced. "Daddy makes good puzzles." "Yes, he does," Genevieve agreed, and the warmth in her voice made Ben's chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't quite ready to name. The first real test of their partnership came when they encountered a problem Marcus's plans hadn't anticipated. The foundation had settled slightly over the 2 years since construction had stopped, throwing off some of the measurements for the interior framing. "We could shimming everything to match the original plans," Ben explained, showing Genevieve the survey marks he'd made. "Or we could adjust the design slightly to accommodate the actual conditions." What would Marcus have done? Ben considered the question seriously. "Based on everything I've learned about him, I think he would have found a way to work with what we have, while staying true to his overall vision." They spent the afternoon developing a solution that maintained the proportions and sightlines Marcus had planned, while accommodating the foundation's new reality. It required subtle adjustments to several elements, but the end result would actually improve the natural light flow into the main studio space. "You know," Genevieve said as they reviewed their modified plans, "I think Marcus would approve. He always said the best solutions were the ones that turned problems into opportunities." The work was progressing faster than Ben had expected, partly because of Genevieve's involvement and partly because Marcus's careful planning had eliminated many of the usual delays and complications. But it was also becoming clear that this was more than just a construction project for both of them. One morning in early November, Ben arrived to find Genevieve already at the worksite, standing in what would become the main studio space and looking out through the newly installed windows. She was wearing jeans and an old sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she looked more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. "I dreamed about this room last night," she said without turning around. "I could see it finished easels set up by the windows, canvases stacked along the walls, the smell of oil paint and turpentine in the air." "Marcus's dream?" "No," she said quietly. "Mine." The admission hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Ben busied himself setting up his tools, giving Genevieve space to process whatever she was feeling. "I've been thinking about what Tommy said," she continued. "About practice making things better, not perfect. I'd like to try painting again." "Again?" "I took art classes in college before I got swept up in business school and technology and making money." She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "I was never very good at it, but I enjoyed it. I'd forgotten that you could enjoy something without being good at it." "Maybe that's part of what Marcus was trying to give you," Ben suggested. "Permission to try things without pressure to be perfect." As November progressed, their daily routines at the guest house took on a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for construction work, with Genevieve learning new skills while Ben tackled the more complex carpentry. Afternoons, when Tommy arrived from school, became times for lighter tasks and conversation. Ben found himself sharing stories about his life before Tommy, about his apprenticeship as a furniture maker and the satisfaction he'd found in creating pieces that would last for generations. Genevieve talked about her business career, the challenges of building a company in a male-dominated industry, and the gradual realization that success hadn't brought her the fulfillment she'd expected. "Marcus used to say I was so focused on building a future that I forgot to live in the present," she admitted one afternoon as they installed the last of the custom windows. "He was right. I thought I could always circle back to the things that mattered once I'd achieved enough success." "What changed?" Ben asked. "He died," she said simply, "and I realized that all the success in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't have someone to share it with." That evening, as Ben prepared to leave for the day, Genevieve stopped him by the truck. "Ben, I want you to know that this project working with you, watching you with Tommy, seeing this place come to life, it's given me something I didn't even know I'd lost." "What's that?" "Hope," she said. "Hope that it's possible to build something new while still honoring what came before." As Ben drove home, he found himself thinking about the subtle changes he'd observed in Genevieve over the past few weeks. The carefully controlled reserve was still there, but it was softening around the edges. She laughed more easily now, especially when Tommy was around. She asked questions with genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, Ben caught her studying him with an expression that made his pulse quicken. The guest house was more than half finished now, its bones clearly visible and its final form beginning to emerge. But Ben was beginning to understand that the real construction project wasn't the building at all. It was the careful, delicate work of three wounded people learning to trust each other, learning to believe that it was possible to build something beautiful from the pieces of their broken dreams. Marcus's tools had played their part in that construction too, carrying forward the love and care of their original owner while serving a new purpose in hands that honored their legacy. As Ben carefully cleaned and returned each tool to its designated place in the antique toolbox each evening, He felt the weight of responsibility and the lightness of hope in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring them closer to completion, closer to the moment when they would have to decide what came next. But tonight, Ben allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than just finished carpentry and a steady paycheck. Tonight, he let himself dream of a life built on more than just survival, a life that honored the past while embracing the possibility of love renewed. The unfinished painting sat on its easel like a ghost in the corner of Marcus's basement workshop. Ben had noticed it every time he came down to select tools, but it wasn't until a grey November morning that he finally stopped to study it properly. Marcus had captured the guest house exactly as they were building. The proportions, the light, even the way the morning sun would angle through the east-facing windows. But it was more than architectural accuracy that made the painting remarkable. Marcus had somehow infused it with emotion, with the anticipation of joy and creativity that the space would contain. The brushstrokes were confident but not overworked, showing the hand of someone who painted for love rather than recognition. He started that 3 days before he died. Genevieve's voice came from behind him. Ben turned to find her standing at the foot of the stairs, her face shadowed with the familiar mix of grief and longing he'd learned to recognize. "It's beautiful," Ben said honestly. He had real talent. He never thought so, always said he was just a businessman who played with paint on weekends. Genevieve moved closer to the easel, her fingers hovering near the canvas without quite touching it. "I used to tell him he should show his work. Maybe have a little exhibition at the local gallery. He'd just laugh and say his art was for joy, not judgment." Ben looked at the painting again, seeing it through new eyes. "Maybe that's the best kind of art. I've been thinking about what you said about finishing what he started while letting something new grow." Genevieve's voice was thoughtful, careful. "What if we completed the painting together? I could try to finish what he began." The suggestion hung between them, loaded with significance that went far beyond art. Ben understood that this wasn't just about completing a canvas, it was about Genevieve finding the courage to create something of her own while honoring Marcus's memory. "Do you think you're ready for that?" he asked gently. "I don't know, but I think Marcus would want me to try." That afternoon, when Tommy arrived from school, he found them setting up a makeshift art station in the guest house's main room. Genevieve had brought down some of Marcus's paints and brushes, and Ben had positioned the easel to catch the same light that had inspired the original painting. "Miss Jen, are you going to paint a picture?" Tommy asked with the direct curiosity that made adults either uncomfortable or charmed. Genevieve, Ben was relieved to note, fell into the latter category. "I'm going to try," she said. "Your daddy suggested I might finish a painting that someone else started." Tommy nodded seriously. "Sometimes when I can't finish my puzzles, Mrs. Chen helps me. She says 2 people can make something better than 1 person alone." "That's very wise, Tommy," Genevieve said, and Ben saw her glance at him with something that might have been hope. Watching Genevieve paint was like watching someone rediscover a lost language. Her first strokes were tentative, uncertain, but as she began to add details to Marcus's foundation, confidence crept into her movements. She had an intuitive understanding of color and light that surprised them both. "I'd forgotten how peaceful this could be," she murmured, adding subtle highlights to the windows Marcus had sketched in. "When I was painting in college, it was the only time my mind got completely quiet." "Maybe that's what Marcus was trying to give you," Ben suggested, "a way back to that quiet place." Tommy appointed himself the official paint organizer, arranging colors in careful gradations that somehow made perfect sense. His autism gave him an unusual ability to see patterns and relationships that others missed, and Ben was touched to see how naturally Genevieve incorporated his suggestions into her work. "Tommy thinks this yellow needs to be warmer," Genevieve said, mixing a tiny amount of orange into the paint on her palette. "He's right. The light in the morning is golden, not lemony." As the afternoon progressed, Ben found himself dividing his attention between his carpentry work and the quiet scene of Genevieve painting, while Tommy offered his precise observations about color and light. There was something deeply peaceful about the combination of sounds, the whisper of brush against canvas, the gentle tap of his hammer, Tommy's soft humming as he organized supplies. It was during one of these companionable silences that Ben's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice that greeted him when he answered made his blood run cold. "Mr. Walker, this is Jennifer Morrison from the law firm of Morrison Clark Associates. I represent Mr. and Mrs. David Patterson regarding their grandson, Thomas Walker." Ben stepped outside, his heart hammering against his ribs. Tommy's maternal grandparents had been absent from their lives since Sarah's funeral, when they'd made it clear they blamed Ben for their daughter's death. He'd hoped their silence meant they'd moved on. "What can I do for you, Miss Morrison?" he managed to say. "My clients are concerned about Thomas's living situation. They've become aware that you've recently lost your employment and may be facing financial difficulties. They wanted to explore options for ensuring Thomas's stability and well-being." The legal language didn't disguise the threat. Ben closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the life he'd built with Tommy suddenly precarious. "Tommy is fine. We're fine. I have work now. Temporary work. From what we understand, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson have a stable home, excellent schools in their district, and the resources to provide Thomas with the best possible care for his special needs." "Tommy doesn't need the best possible care," Ben said, his voice sharper than he intended. "He needs love and consistency and people who understand him. He has that with me." "Mr. Walker, no one is questioning your love for your son. But love isn't always enough. My clients simply want what's best for Thomas." After the lawyer hung up, Ben stood in the crisp November air, trying to process what had just happened. He'd known this was possible. Tommy's grandparents had money and connections, while Ben had a recently unemployed single father with a special needs child. In the eyes of a family court, he might look like the less stable option. "Ben?" Genevieve's voice came from behind him. "Is everything all right?" He turned to find her standing in the doorway, concern written across her face. Through the window behind her, he could see Tommy carefully arranging paintbrushes, completely absorbed in his task, and blissfully unaware that his world might be about to change. "Tommy's grandparents," Ben said, the words tasting bitter. "They're making noises about custody." Genevieve's expression shifted from concern to something fiercer. On what grounds? Financial instability, recent unemployment, the usual concerns about a single father raising a special needs child. Ben ran his hands through his hair, trying to think clearly. "They're not wrong about the finances. Even with this job, I'm barely keeping up with Tommy's therapy costs and the basic bills." "But they're wrong about everything else," Genevieve said firmly. "Anyone who spends 5 minutes watching you with Tommy can see that he's thriving in your care." Ben wanted to believe that would be enough, but he'd heard too many stories about family courts prioritizing financial stability over emotional bonds. "They have resources I can't match. Private schools, specialists, college funds. From a practical standpoint, they're idiots," Genevieve interrupted, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "Tommy doesn't need a college fund. He needs his father. He needs someone who sees his gifts instead of his challenges, who celebrates his victories instead of just managing his difficulties." Her fierce defense of Tommy and, by extension, of Ben warmed something in his chest that had been cold with fear. But it also highlighted the distance between their worlds. Genevieve could afford to be indignant about the Pattersons' focus on money because she'd never had to choose between therapy sessions and groceries. "I appreciate that," Ben said carefully, "but the reality is that courts look at practical things. Stable housing, consistent income, educational opportunities. And right now you're employed by me," Genevieve said, "with excellent references and a demonstrated work ethic. If they want to question your stability, they'll have to go through me." The offer was generous, but it also complicated things in ways that Ben wasn't sure either of them was ready to explore. Their working relationship had been gradually shifting into something more personal, but involving Genevieve in a custody battle would change the dynamic entirely. "I can't ask you to do that," he said. "You're not asking, I'm offering. Her green eyes were steady, determined. "Tommy belongs with you, Ben. Anyone with eyes can see that." Before Ben could respond, Tommy appeared in the doorway, his face bright with excitement. "Daddy, Miss Jen, come see what we made. The painting looks just like the real house now." Ben followed Tommy back inside, grateful for the interruption, but aware that the conversation with Genevieve was far from over. The painting on the easel had indeed been transformed. Genevieve had completed Marcus's vision, while adding her own touches, subtle details that brought the scene to life. "It's beautiful," Ben said honestly. "Marcus would be proud." "I think he would be," Genevieve agreed. But her eyes were on Tommy, who was explaining to them in careful detail how he'd helped organize the colors to make the painting process more efficient. Watching his son animated, happy, completely secure in the knowledge that he was loved and valued, Ben felt his resolve strengthen. The Pattersons might have money and lawyers, but they didn't have this. They didn't have the daily miracle of Tommy's trust, the small victories that came from understanding his unique way of seeing the world. "Ben," Genevieve said quietly while Tommy was absorbed in cleaning paintbrushes with his characteristic precision, "I meant what I said, about helping with the legal situation." "Why?" The question came out more bluntly than he'd intended. Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy work. "Because watching you with him, seeing the way you've built your entire life around giving him what he needs, reminded me what real love looks like. Not the grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the daily choice to put someone else's happiness before your own." She paused, her fingers unconsciously touching the wedding ring that hung from her necklace. "Marcus used to tell me that love isn't about having enough money or the perfect circumstances. It's about showing up every day, regardless of how hard things get. You've been showing up for Tommy his entire life, Ben. That has to count for something." As they cleaned up for the day, Ben found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been a desperate man knocking on doors, willing to work for free just to keep his son's world stable. Now he was caught between the growing warmth of unexpected connection and the cold fear of losing everything that mattered. The painting stood on its easel, a symbol of completion and new beginnings. But Ben was beginning to understand that some things couldn't be finished with brushes and paint. Some things required the kind of courage that had nothing to do with artistic talent and everything to do with faith in the possibility of love. The custody papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed Ben the manila envelope outside the guest house. Ben's hands shook slightly as he read the legal language that reduced his life with Tommy to a series of allegations and concerns. Inadequate housing, financial instability, inability to provide optimal educational opportunities. Genevieve found him sitting on the stone steps of the main house an hour later, the papers scattered around him like autumn leaves. She took one look at his face and sat down beside him without a word. 60 days, Ben said, his voice hollow. "I have 60 days to prove I can provide a stable home environment, or they get temporary custody pending a full hearing." Genevieve picked up one of the papers, scanning the legal terminology with the focused attention she'd once brought to business contracts. "This is ridiculous. Listen to this: concerns about the child's educational development in an unconventional family structure. What does that even mean?" "It means they think Tommy would be better off with grandparents who can afford private schools and live-in tutors than with a father who loves him but works with his hands." Ben scrubbed his face with his palms. "Maybe they're right." "Don't you dare," Genevieve said sharply. "Don't you dare let their money and lawyers make you doubt what you know to be true. Tommy is thriving because of you, not in spite of you." But even as she spoke the words, Ben could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. The reality of his situation, a single father living in a trailer, recently unemployed, facing legal challenges from people with unlimited resources, must look different when viewed through the lens of potential scandal and social judgment. "You don't have to get involved in this," he said quietly. "I know what it looks like from the outside. Poor man, rich woman, custody battle. People will talk. Let them talk." But her voice lacked the conviction it had held the day before. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black sedan pulling up the circular driveway. Ben watched as two people emerged, a woman in her early 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, and a man about the same age, whose bearing suggested military background or corporate authority. "The Pattersons," Ben said, recognizing them from the few photos Sarah had kept. They looked exactly like what they were: successful, well-connected people who were used to getting their way. David Patterson was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that filled boardrooms and intimidated opponents. His wife Margaret was elegant in the way that money and careful maintenance could achieve, her blonde hair styled in a way that suggested regular appointments at expensive salons. They walked up to the guest house with the confidence of people who owned whatever space they entered. Ben stood to meet them, acutely aware of his work clothes and the sawdust in his hair. "Mr. Walker," David Patterson said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, assessing. "I'm David Patterson, and this is my wife Margaret. I believe you know why we're here." "I do," Ben replied, keeping his voice steady, "but I'm not sure why you felt the need to involve lawyers instead of talking to me directly." Margaret Patterson spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated at prestigious schools. "Because talking hasn't worked, Mr. Walker. We've watched from a distance for 8 years, while our grandson lived in circumstances that Sarah never would have accepted." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Ben felt Genevieve stiffen beside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Tommy is happy and healthy. His doctors will confirm that he's making excellent progress in all his therapies. Progress that could be accelerated with proper resources," David Patterson said. "We're not questioning your affection for the boy, but affection isn't enough. Tommy needs specialized education, exposure to cultural opportunities, preparation for a future that extends beyond." He gestured vaguely at the construction site around them. "Beyond what?" Ben asked, his temper beginning to fray. "Beyond honest work? Beyond people who value character over bank accounts?" "Beyond limitations," Margaret Patterson said sharply. "Tommy is a bright child with special needs that require special resources you simply cannot provide." "And what do you know about Tommy's needs?" Genevieve spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "When was the last time you saw him? Spoke to him? Attended one of his therapy sessions?" The Pattersons turned to look at her with surprise, as if they'd forgotten she was there. Ben saw the moment when they took in her expensive clothes, her confident bearing, the obvious wealth that surrounded them at the estate. "I'm sorry," David Patterson said with careful politeness. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Genevieve Langston, this is my property, and Ben is my employee." She stood straighter, and Ben could see her shifting into the mode that had made her successful in business. "I've had the opportunity to observe both Ben and Tommy extensively over the past several weeks. If you have concerns about Tommy's welfare, I'd be happy to address them." Margaret Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. "How nice that Ben has found such a supportive employer. I'm sure that will be noted in our filing." The implication was clear, and Ben felt heat rise in his cheeks. But before he could respond, the sound of a car door slamming drew their attention. Mrs. Chen's blue sedan had pulled up behind the Pattersons' luxury car, and Tommy was climbing out of the passenger seat. "Daddy!" Tommy called out, running toward them with his backpack bouncing. But he stopped short when he saw the strangers, his face shifting into the careful, guarded expression he wore when meeting new people. "Tommy," Ben said gently, "these are your mother's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson." Tommy studied them with the intense focus he brought to anything unfamiliar. After a long moment he said, "You look like Mommy in the pictures." Margaret Patterson's composure cracked slightly. "Hello, Thomas. You've grown so much." "Tommy," he corrected automatically. "I don't like Thomas. It sounds too serious." David Patterson crouched down to Tommy's level, his voice taking on the artificially cheerful tone adults often used with children. "Well, Tommy, how would you like to come visit us for a while? We have a big house with a swimming pool and lots of books." Tommy glanced at his father, then back at the Pattersons. "Will Daddy come too?" "Well, no, but—" "Then no, thank you," Tommy said politely. I live with Daddy. We're a family." The simple declaration hung in the air, and Ben saw something shift in both Patterson's expressions. For the first time, they were seeing Tommy not as an abstract child in need of rescue, but as a real person with his own feelings and attachments. "Tommy," Margaret Patterson said, her voice softer now, "we just want what's best for you. We want to make sure you have every opportunity." "I have opportunities," Tommy interrupted, which was unusual for him. He rarely contradicted adults. "I have my therapy with Dr. Martinez and my day program, and Mrs. Chen teaches me to cook, and now I have Miss Jen, who's teaching me about art." He looked at Genevieve with obvious affection. "We're painting a picture together." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret said, but Ben could see the calculation in her eyes. She was taking note of every detail, every relationship that could be used in court. After the Pattersons left with polite but unmistakable threats about seeing everyone in court, Ben found himself sitting alone in the unfinished guest house. Tommy was inside with Mrs. Chen, working on homework, and Genevieve had retreated to the main house to make some phone calls. When she returned an hour later, her expression was troubled. "I've been thinking," she said, settling beside him on the makeshift bench he'd built from sawhorses and a plank, "about what this custody battle might mean, for all of us." Ben's stomach clenched. "You're reconsidering getting involved?" "I'm considering what's best for Tommy," she said carefully. "Ben, you know I think you're an excellent father, but I also know how these things work. The Pattersons have money and influence. They'll hire investigators, dig into every aspect of your life, and mine too if I'm supporting you." The words she wasn't saying hung between them. Genevieve had wealth and status to protect. A custody battle involving her employee would inevitably attract attention, speculation, gossip that could damage her reputation in ways that might never be repaired. "I understand," Ben said, and he did. He'd been foolish to think that their growing connection could survive the harsh realities of legal warfare and social scrutiny. "Do you?" Genevieve asked. "Because I'm not sure I do. 6 weeks ago, I was living in a house full of memories, going through the motions of life without really living. Then you knocked on my door, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to hope for something more than just getting through another day." She turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "But hoping and fighting are different things, and fighting the Pattersons means putting everything I've built here at risk." Ben nodded, understanding the impossible position he'd put her in. "You don't owe me anything, Genevieve. You've already given me more than I had any right to expect." As they sat in the gathering dusk, the guest house around them nearly complete, but their future together suddenly uncertain, Ben realized that some renovations couldn't be finished with tools and determination alone. Some required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with carpentry and everything to do with faith in the possibility that love might be stronger than fear. The custody papers lay on the workbench where he'd left them, a reminder that in 60 days, everything he'd built with Tommy might be torn apart by people who measured love in dollars and opportunities in privilege. But for tonight, he had this moment the smell of fresh wood shavings, the sound of Tommy's laughter drifting from the main house, and the memory of Genevieve's hand in his as they'd worked together to create something beautiful. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and strategies and the grinding machinery of the legal system. Tonight, he would hold on to hope and try to believe that sometimes love really was enough. Ben was organizing Marcus's tools when he found the letter. It had slipped down between the felt lining and the wooden bottom of the toolbox's smallest drawer, hidden for over 2 years in the one place Genevieve rarely looked. The envelope was cream-colored paper, expensive quality, with "My darling Jen" written across the front in Marcus's careful handwriting. For a moment, Ben considered putting it back, pretending he'd never found it. This was clearly private, meant for Genevieve's eyes alone. But something about the way it had been hidden, deliberately placed where only someone using the tools regularly would discover it, made him hesitate. He climbed the stairs from the basement workshop and found Genevieve in the main studio space of the guest house, putting the finishing touches on their collaborative painting. The late November light streaming through the windows she and Ben had crafted together gave her auburn hair a golden sheen. "Genevieve," he said quietly, "I found something." She looked up from the canvas, a small smile playing at her lips. Another one of Marcus's detailed notes about proper wood grain orientation. "No." Ben held out the envelope, watching as her expression shifted from mild curiosity to recognition to something that might have been fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the letter. "Where did you find this?" "Hidden in the bottom of the tool drawer. I think Marcus wanted it to be discovered by whoever finished his work." Genevieve stared at the envelope for a long moment, as if it might contain something dangerous. "I'm not sure I'm ready to read this. Would you like me to leave you alone?" She looked up at him, her green eyes wide with uncertainty. "No, stay, please." With careful fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. Ben could see Marcus's handwriting, covering both sides of 3 sheets of paper. Genevieve's eyes moved across the lines, and Ben watched a complex series of emotions cross her face: love, grief, surprise, and something that looked almost like relief. "He knew," she whispered after several minutes of silence. "He knew about his heart condition. The doctors had told him it was serious, possibly fatal, but he never told me." Ben felt his chest tighten. "What does he say?" Genevieve's voice was shaky as she began to read aloud. "My dearest Jen, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and someone else is using my tools to finish our studio. I hope that person understands what this place means to us, what it was always meant to become." She paused, looking up at Ben with tears in her eyes. He goes on to explain about his diagnosis, about why he didn't tell me. He says he didn't want our last months together to be overshadowed by fear and sadness. "That sounds like something he would do," Ben said gently, "from everything you've told me about him." Genevieve continued reading, her voice growing stronger. "But this letter isn't really about me, my darling. It's about you and the life you need to build after I'm gone. I know you, Jen. I know you'll want to preserve everything exactly as it was, turn our home into a shrine to our marriage. Please don't do that. Please don't stop living because I had to stop." Ben watched Genevieve's face as she absorbed her husband's words. He could see the internal struggle, grief and guilt warring with the permission Marcus was giving her from beyond the grave. "There's more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She took a shaky breath and continued. "I've been watching you work in the garden, and I see how you light up when you're creating something beautiful. I see the way you arrange flowers, choose colors, solve problems with an artist's instinct, even though you insist you're not creative. The studio I'm building isn't just for me, my love. It's for both of us. It's my gift to the artist in you that I see even when you don't." Genevieve had to stop reading, overcome by emotion. Ben moved closer, offering silent support as she struggled to compose herself. "He knew me better than I knew myself," she said when she could speak again. "I always thought the studio was his dream, his project, but he was building it for me." "What else does he say?" Genevieve's hands shook as she found her place in the letter again. "And when you're ready, not tomorrow or next month, but when your heart tells you it's time, I want you to find love again. Not to replace what we had, because that's impossible, but to discover what new kind of happiness is possible." She looked up at Ben, her eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. "He describes the kind of man he hopes I'll find. Listen to this. I hope you find someone who works with his hands and loves with his whole heart. Someone who understands that the most beautiful things in life are built slowly, with patience and care. Someone who sees your worth not in what you've accomplished, but in who you are when you think no one is watching." The words hung between them like a bridge, neither was quite ready to cross. Ben felt his pulse quicken as he recognized himself in Marcus's description, but he also felt something else, a sharp stab of doubt. "Ben," Genevieve said softly, "when you first came to my door, when I said you were the man I'd been looking for—" "You'd already read this letter," Ben said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You hired me because I fit Marcus's description." "No," Genevieve said quickly. "I mean, yes, I had read parts of it before, but not this part. I only read the first page, about his diagnosis and his love for me. I couldn't finish it then. It was too painful. But Ben was already stepping back, the tools in his hands suddenly feeling foreign and unwelcome. So everything, this job, this project, whatever this is between yous, it's all because I happened to match your dead husband's checklist for your next relationship. That's not how it happened, Genevieve protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Ben, please, let me explain. What's to explain? Ben's voice was bitter now, all the doubts and insecurities he'd been fighting for weeks, crystallizing into hurt and anger. You weren't looking for Ben Walker. You were looking for Marcus's replacement, someone who worked with his hands and loved with his whole heart, someone close enough to what you'd lost that you could pretend you weren't settling. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Ben set down the tools he'd been holding with careful precision, his movements deliberate and final. I understand that every conversation we've had, every moment I thought we were connecting, you were just checking off boxes on your dead husband's list. Genevieve stood up, the letter still clutched in her hands. Ben, that's not fair. Yes, Marcus's words resonated with me when I met you. But what I feel for you, what we've built together, that's real. That's not about Marcus. Isn't it? Ben asked. This whole project, bringing his studio to life, using his tools, following his plans, it's all about Marcus. And now I find out I was just another part of his grand design for your future happiness. He walked to the window they'd installed together, looking out at the estate grounds where he'd spent the happiest weeks he'd had in years. I thought I was building something new with you. I thought maybe, for the first time since Sarah died, I'd found someone who saw me for who I am, not just as a solution to their problems. You are, Genevieve said, moving closer. Ben, you have to believe me. Whatever brought you to my door, what I feel for you now has nothing to do with Marcus's letter. But Ben was already shaking his head. I can't do this, Genevieve. I can't be someone's second choice, someone's safe option recommended by their dead husband. I've spent my whole life trying to be worthy of love on my own merits. I won't settle for being a consolation prize, even one chosen by someone as good as Marcus apparently was. He walked to the door, then turned back. I'll finish the guest house. I gave you my word on that, and I keep my promises. But after that, I think it's best if we keep our relationship professional. Ben, please. I need some time to think, he said, about all of this, about what's real and what's just wishful thinking. As Ben drove home that evening, Marcus's letter seemed to burn in his memory. Every word of it made sense. Every observation about the kind of man Genevieve needed was accurate. But that was exactly the problem. He didn't want to be the man Marcus had ordered for Genevieve like a piece of custom furniture. He wanted to be the man she chose for herself, independent of anyone else's recommendations or requirements. The custody battle suddenly seemed like the least of his problems. He could fight the Pattersons with lawyers and character witnesses and documentation of Tommy's happiness and progress. But how did you fight a ghost? How did you compete with a dead man's perfect understanding of the woman you were falling in love with? When he arrived home, Tommy was waiting by the window as always, his face lighting up at the sight of his father. "Daddy, did you finish the pretty house today?" "Almost, buddy," Ben said, pulling his son into a fierce hug. "Almost finished." But as he held Tommy close, Ben realized that some things, once broken, couldn't be repaired with all the skill and tools in the world. Some things required a different kind of craftsmanship altogether, the delicate art of building trust in love that was freely given rather than carefully prescribed. The letter had changed everything, and Ben wasn't sure if what he and Genevieve had been building together could survive the weight of Marcus's loving, well-intentioned manipulation from beyond the grave. 3 weeks of silence stretched between Ben and Genevieve like a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. Ben continued working on the guest house, arriving early and leaving as soon as his contracted hours were complete. Genevieve kept to the main house, though he sometimes caught glimpses of her watching from the windows, her face shadowed with what looked like regret. The guest house was nearly complete, now windows installed, floors finished, the built-in storage cabinets crafted exactly to Marcus's specifications. It was beautiful work, some of the best Ben had ever done, but it felt hollow without the collaborative joy that had marked their earlier efforts. Tommy noticed the change immediately. "Why doesn't Miss Jen come to see us anymore?" he asked one afternoon as Ben packed up his tools. "Did we make her sad?" "Nobody," Ben said, his heart aching at his son's confusion. "Miss Jen isn't sad because of us. Sometimes grown-ups just need space to figure things out." But even as he said the words, Ben wasn't sure he believed them. Maybe they had made her sad. Maybe the discovery of Marcus's letter had forced her to confront the reality that her feelings for Ben were based on her dead husband's prescription rather than her own heart. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and Ben's lawyer had warned him that the case wasn't looking good. The Pattersons had hired a team of attorneys and child psychologists who were painting a picture of Ben as a well-meaning but ultimately inadequate guardian. They had documentation of every missed therapy session due to work conflicts, every time Tommy had to stay late at his day program because Ben couldn't pick him up on time, every financial struggle that had impacted their stability. "They're not saying you're a bad father," his lawyer, a kind woman named Sarah Chen, who Mrs. Chen had recommended, explained during their final preparation meeting. "They're saying Tommy deserves better opportunities than you can provide. And legally, that might be enough." It might be. Family courts prioritize the best interests of the child, and if the Pattersons can demonstrate superior resources, educational opportunities, and stability. She shrugged apologetically. Love matters, but it's not always enough in the eyes of the law. Ben spent that weekend trying to prepare Tommy for the possibility that their life together might change dramatically. But how do you explain to an 8-year-old with autism that strangers in suits might decide he belonged somewhere else? "Tommy," he said on Sunday evening as they sat together on their small couch, "you know how sometimes things change even when we don't want them to." Tommy nodded seriously, "Like when my day program teacher moved away." "Right. Well, there might be some changes coming for us too. Some people think you might be happier living in a different house." Tommy's face scrunched up in the expression he wore when trying to process something that didn't make sense. "But I'm happy here, with you." "I know you are, buddy, and I'm happy with you too. But sometimes other people think they know what's best for us better than we do." "That's silly," Tommy said with the blunt honesty that cut straight to the heart of things. "Nobody knows me better than you do." Monday morning dawned grey and drizzling, matching Ben's mood as he helped Tommy get ready for school. Mrs. Chen would pick the boy up afterward and keep him until the hearing was over one way or another. "Will you be here when I get home?" Tommy asked as Ben knelt to help him with his backpack. "I hope so," Ben said honestly. "I'm going to try very hard to make sure I am." Tommy hugged him fiercely, his small arms wrapping around Ben's neck with desperate strength. "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, Tommy, more than anything in the whole world." The courthouse was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered. Ben met Sarah Chen in the lobby, noting how the Pattersons' legal team filled an entire row of chairs in the waiting area. David and Margaret Patterson looked confident, well-rested, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Ben made in a month. "Mr. Walker," David Patterson approached him before they were called into the courtroom. "I want you to know that we don't take any pleasure in this. We simply want what's best for Tommy." "His name is Tommy," Ben said quietly, "and what's best for him is staying with the father who's loved and cared for him every day of his life." "Love isn't always enough," Margaret Patterson said, echoing the words Ben's own lawyer had used. "Tommy needs stability, educational opportunities, exposure to culture and experiences that will prepare him for the future." "He needs his father," Ben replied. "Everything else is just details." The hearing itself was a blur of testimony and evidence presentation. The Pattersons' lawyers painted a picture of Ben as loving but ultimately limited a man, whose financial struggles and educational background made him unsuitable to guide a gifted child with special needs. They presented reports from expensive specialists, recommendations for private schools that catered to children with autism, projections of Tommy's potential if given access to unlimited resources. Ben's lawyer did her best to counter with evidence of Tommy's happiness and progress under his father's care. She presented glowing reports from Dr. Pays, Martinez about Tommy's emotional development, testimony from Mrs. Chen about the loving home environment Ben had created, documentation of every therapy session attended and milestone achieved. But Ben could see the judge, weighing practical concerns against emotional bonds, measuring love against opportunity, in ways that reduced his relationship with Tommy to data points and statistics. It was during the afternoon recess that Ben saw her. Genevieve stood in the courthouse lobby, dressed in a navy suit that spoke of both wealth and serious purpose. She was talking to a man in an expensive overcoat, clearly another lawyer, given the briefcase and the way he carried himself with professional authority. Ben's heart lurched at the sight of her, despite everything that had happened between them, despite the hurt and confusion of the past 3 weeks. Seeing her there felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. She looked up and caught his eye across the crowded lobby. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, 3 weeks of silence and misunderstanding stretching between them like a physical barrier. Then she was walking toward him, her heels clicking against the marble floor with determined precision. "Ben," she said when she reached him, "I know you probably don't want to see me right now, but I couldn't let this happen without." "What are you doing here?" he interrupted, acutely aware of the Pattersons and their legal team watching from across the lobby. "I'm here to testify on your behalf," she said simply, "if you'll let me." Ben felt his lawyer appear at his elbow. "Mr. Walker, we need to discuss." "Sarah Chen," Ben said automatically. "This is Genevieve Langston. Genevieve, my attorney." The two women shook hands, and Ben saw his lawyer's eyes widen slightly as she recognized the name. Everyone in their small Virginia town knew who Genevieve Langston was. "Ms. Langston," Sarah said carefully, "while we appreciate any support for Ben, I should warn you that character testimony from an employer can sometimes be dismissed as biased or—" "I'm not here as his employer," Genevieve interrupted. "I'm here as someone who has witnessed firsthand the extraordinary father Ben is to Tommy. I'm here because that little boy deserves to stay with the man who has built his entire life around making Tommy feel loved and valued." She turned back to Ben, her green eyes intense with purpose. "I know things have been complicated between us. I know you have every reason to question my motives. But this isn't about us, Ben. This is about Tommy. The Pattersons' lawyers will tear you apart," Ben said. "They'll make it look like you're some wealthy woman who got emotionally involved with her employee. They'll make it seem sordid and inappropriate. Let them try," Genevieve said, and Ben heard the steel that had made her successful in business. "I've faced down boardrooms full of men who thought they could intimidate me. I can handle a few lawyers." Sarah Chen was looking between them with growing understanding. "Ms. Langston, what exactly is your relationship with Mr. Walker and Tommy?" "Ben has been restoring a building on my property. During that time, I've had extensive opportunities to observe his parenting. Tommy visits the worksite regularly after school and on weekends. I've seen Ben navigate autism meltdowns with patience that would make professional therapists weep with envy. I've watched him sacrifice his own needs, food, sleep, comfort, to ensure Tommy has everything he needs to thrive." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "More than that, I've seen Tommy with his father. I've seen a child who is completely secure in the knowledge that he is loved unconditionally. The Pattersons can offer private schools and expensive therapies, but they can't offer what Ben gives Tommy every single day, the absolute certainty that he is valued exactly as he is." Before Ben could respond, the bailiff was calling them back into the courtroom. As they filed back in, Ben caught sight of Tommy's drawing tucked into his lawyer's briefcase, a crayon picture Tommy had made, showing the three of them standing in front of the completed guest house, all of them smiling. In Tommy's world, they were already a family. The afternoon session began with the Pattersons' final arguments. Their lead attorney painted a compelling picture of the opportunities they could provide: a specialized schools, unlimited therapy resources, cultural experiences, college preparation that would set Tommy up for lifelong success. The question before this court, the lawyer concluded, is not whether Mr. Walker loves his son. Clearly, he does. The question is whether love alone is sufficient when superior alternatives exist. Can this court, in good conscience, deny Thomas Walker the advantages that could transform his life simply because his father means well? Then it was Sarah Chen's turn to present Ben's case. She called Dr. Martinez, who testified about Tommy's emotional stability and the crucial role his father played in his development. She called Mrs. Chen, who spoke about the loving home Ben had created and the daily acts of devotion she witnessed. And then she called Genevieve. Watching Genevieve take the witness stand, Ben was struck by her poise and determination. She faced the Pattersons' lead attorney with the same calm confidence she'd probably brought to business negotiations worth millions of dollars. "Miss Langston," the Patterson attorney began, his tone suggesting he intended to discredit her testimony before she'd barely begun. "You employ Mr. Walker, is that correct?" "Yes." "And how long have you known him?" "Approximately 2 months." 2 months, the attorney repeated, as if the short time frame proved his point. "And in those 2 months, you've developed quite strong opinions about his fitness as a parent." "I've developed strong convictions based on extensive observation," Genevieve corrected. "Mr. Walker works on my property daily. His son visits frequently. I've had numerous opportunities to observe their relationship." "Miss Langston, isn't it true that you recently lost your husband and might be emotionally vulnerable to a man who presents himself as a devoted single father?" Ben saw Genevieve's jaw tighten, but her voice remained steady. "My personal circumstances don't change what I've observed about Ben Walker's parenting. But they might color your perception, might they not? A wealthy widow, a handsome employee in need." "Objection," Sarah Chen said sharply. "Relevance?" "Sustained," the judge ruled. "Counsel, please focus on the witness's observations regarding the child in question." The attorney changed tactics. "Miss Langston, you're not married, correct? You have no children of your own." "That's correct." "So your opinions about parenting are purely theoretical, based on limited observation rather than actual experience." It was then that Genevieve did something Ben would remember for the rest of his life. She looked directly at Tommy's drawing, which Sarah had placed on the defense table as evidence, and her expression softened with genuine love. "You're right that I don't have children of my own," she said, "but I know what it looks like when a child feels completely safe and loved. I know what it sounds like when a little boy talks about his daddy with absolute trust and adoration. I know what it means when an 8-year-old with autism, who struggles with change and new situations, immediately feels comfortable enough with his father's presence to explore and learn and grow." She looked directly at the Pattersons. "Tommy doesn't need more opportunities. He needs the one person who has never failed him, never questioned his worth, never tried to fix him or change him. He needs his father." The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even the Pattersons' attorney seemed momentarily at a loss for words. As Genevieve stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes met Ben's across the courtroom. In that moment, all the hurt and confusion of the past 3 weeks seemed to fall away. Whatever had brought them together, whatever complications Marcus's letter had created, this moment was purely about Tommy and the future they all wanted to protect. The judge called for a recess to review the testimony and evidence. As they waited in the courthouse lobby, Ben found himself standing next to Genevieve near the tall windows that looked out onto the grey December afternoon. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you said in there, for being here." "I meant every word," she replied. "Tommy belongs with you, Ben. Anyone with eyes can see that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the rain streak down the windows. Then Genevieve spoke again, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her. "I've been thinking about Marcus's letter," she said, "about what it means and what it doesn't mean." Ben waited, not trusting himself to speak. "Marcus knew me well enough to describe the kind of man who might make me happy," she continued. "But he couldn't have known you, Ben. He couldn't have known your laugh or the way you are with Tommy, or how safe I feel when you're near. He couldn't have known that you'd challenge me to be braver than I thought I could be, or that you'd see something in me worth believing in." She turned to face him fully, What I feel for you, that's not something Marcus wrote in a letter. That's something we built together, one conversation at a time, one shared moment at a time. And if you'll let me, I'd like to keep building it." Before Ben could respond, the bailiff was calling them back into the courtroom for the judge's decision. As they filed back in, Ben felt something shift inside him, not just hope for the custody decision, but hope for something larger. Hope that love really could be stronger than fear, that trust could be rebuilt, and that families could be formed in ways that honored the past while embracing the future. The judge was ready to render her decision, and Ben's entire future hung in the balance. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like whatever came next, he wouldn't have to face it alone. Judge Patricia Morrison was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that had seen every kind of family drama the court system could produce. She looked over her reading glasses at the assembled parties with the weary wisdom of someone who understood that there were rarely perfect solutions, only degrees of imperfection that had to be weighed and measured. "This case," she began, her voice carrying the authority of 25 years on the bench, "presents the court with a difficult decision between two loving options for Thomas Walker's future. Both parties clearly want what they believe is best for the child." Ben felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Beside him, Sarah Chen sat perfectly still, her pen poised over her legal pad, but her attention completely focused on the judge's words. "The petitioners, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, have demonstrated significant financial resources and educational opportunities that could benefit Thomas. They have presented compelling evidence of specialized programs, therapeutic interventions, and long-term planning that would address Thomas's unique needs as he grows into adulthood." Ben's stomach dropped. The judge's tone suggested she was building toward a decision that would tear Tommy away from everything he'd ever known. "However," Judge Morrison continued, and Ben felt a flutter of desperate hope, "this court must also consider the profound importance of emotional stability and continuity of care in a child's development, particularly for a child with autism spectrum disorder." She looked directly at Ben, and he saw something in her expression that might have been sympathy. "Mr. Walker, the testimony presented today paints a picture of a father who has consistently prioritized his son's well-being above his own comfort and convenience. Dr. Martinez's reports indicate that Thomas has made remarkable progress under your care, and that progress appears to be directly linked to the security and unconditional acceptance he receives in your home." The judge paused, consulting her notes. Ms. Langston's testimony was particularly compelling. As an objective observer with no familial connection to either party, her descriptions of the father-son relationship carry significant weight with this court. Ben glanced at Genevieve, who was sitting in the gallery behind him. Her face was composed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "That said," Judge Morrison continued, and Ben's hope wavered again, "this court cannot ignore the practical realities of Mr. Walker's financial situation. The evidence shows a pattern of economic instability that has, at times, impacted Thomas's access to consistent therapy and educational support." David Patterson leaned forward slightly, sensing victory within reach. "Therefore," the judge said, her voice taking on the formal tone of legal decision-making, "this court awards temporary custody of Thomas Walker to his father, Benjamin Walker, with the following conditions." Ben's knees nearly buckled with relief, but the judge wasn't finished. "Mr. Walker, you will have 90 days to demonstrate improved financial stability and housing security. During this period, Thomas will remain in your care, but social services will conduct monthly evaluations to ensure his needs are being met adequately." She looked sternly at Ben over her glasses. "If, at the end of 90 days, this court finds that Thomas's circumstances have not improved sufficiently, we will revisit the custody arrangement. The Pattersons' petition will remain active during this probationary period." Sarah Chen was writing furiously, but Ben barely heard the specific conditions the judge was outlining. Tommy was staying with him. For now, at least, they were safe. "Furthermore," Judge Morrison added, This court strongly encourages all parties to consider Thomas's best interests above personal grievances. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, your desire to be involved in your grandson's life is understandable and could be beneficial to him. Perhaps supervised visitation could be arranged to allow Thomas to develop a relationship with his maternal grandparents while maintaining stability in his primary home. The Pattersons' lawyer was already whispering urgently in David Patterson's ear, no doubt explaining the implications of the conditional victory. They had 90 days to prove that Ben couldn't provide adequate stability, and Ben had 90 days to prove that he could. As the court session ended and people began filing out, Ben felt both relief and renewed pressure. He'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. Mr. Walker, Judge Morrison's voice stopped him as he gathered his papers. A word, please. Ben approached the bench, his lawyer beside him. Off the record, the judge said quietly, I believe Thomas belongs with you. Your love for that boy is evident, and his attachment to you is profound. But love alone won't satisfy this court if your living situation deteriorates further. Use these 90 days wisely. Outside the courthouse, Ben found himself surrounded by a small crowd of supporters. Mrs. Chen had arrived just as the session ended, having arranged for a neighbor to watch Tommy. Dr. Martinez had stayed for the decision, offering professional validation for the judge's ruling. But it was Genevieve who reached him first. Congratulations, she said, and the warmth in her voice made his chest tight with emotion. Tommy gets to come home. For now, Ben said, the reality of the 90-day condition tempering his relief. But I still have to prove I can provide the stability they want. You will, Genevieve said with quiet confidence. We will. The pronoun hung between them, loaded with implications that Ben wasn't sure he was ready to explore. But before he could respond, David Patterson was approaching, his wife beside him, and their legal team trailing behind. Mr. Walker, David said, extending his hand with stiff courtesy. Congratulations on today's outcome. Ben shook the offered hand warily. Thank you. I want you to know that our interest in Thomas's well-being hasn't ended. Margaret Patterson added, we hope you'll consider allowing us to be part of his life, as the judge suggested. Ben studied their faces, looking for signs of continued hostility or manipulation. What he saw instead was something he hadn't expected: genuine grief for the daughter they'd lost and sincere concern for the grandson they barely knew. Tommy is a good kid, Ben said carefully. He deserves to know about his mother's family, to understand where he comes from. But any relationship has to be on his terms, at his pace. Of course, David said quickly. We understand that. We want to be part of his life, if you'll let us. It was a conversation that would require time and careful consideration, but for the first time, Ben could see a path forward that didn't involve lawyers and court battles. Maybe, with patience and compromise, they could all find a way to put Tommy's needs first. As the Pattersons walked away with their legal team, Ben turned to find Tommy racing across the courthouse plaza, Mrs. Chen following behind with an indulgent smile. Daddy! Tommy launched himself into Ben's arms with the complete trust that only children possess. Mrs. Chen said you had to talk to important people about where I live. Did you tell them I live with you? I did, buddy, Ben said, holding his son close and breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and the lingering smell of the art supplies from his day program. I told them we're a family, and families stick together. Good, Tommy said with the matter-of-fact certainty that cut straight to the heart of things. I like our family. Can we go home now? Ben looked around at the people who had gathered to support them, Mrs. Chen with her worried but loving smile, Dr. Martinez with his professional satisfaction at seeing his young patient's stability preserved, Sarah Chen with her briefcase full of legal strategies for the challenges ahead, and Genevieve, standing slightly apart but watching with an expression that made Ben's heart skip in ways he was finally ready to acknowledge. Yes, Ben said, lifting Tommy higher in his arms. Let's go home. But as they walked toward their respective cars, Ben realized that the definition of home was evolving in ways he was only beginning to understand. The next 90 days would determine not just where Tommy lived, but what kind of future they might build together, all of them. The completed guest house gleamed in the pale December sunlight, every detail finished to perfection. Ben stood in the doorway, taking in the space that had consumed his days and, if he was honest, his heart for the past 2 months. The custom windows caught the morning light exactly as Marcus had envisioned. The built-in storage cabinets were fitted with precision that would last generations, and the wide plank floors reflected years of careful craftsmanship. It was beautiful, it was perfect, and it was finished. Genevieve found him there an hour later, holding a brass key in her palm and wearing an expression that mixed pride with something that looked like sadness. "It's done," she said simply, offering him the key. "Everything Marcus dreamed of, everything we worked toward, it's complete." Ben took the key, feeling its weight. Such a small thing to represent so much work, so many shared hours, so many conversations that had changed both of their lives. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. Marcus would be proud. "I think he would be," Genevieve agreed. She walked to the center of the main studio space, turning slowly to take in all the details they'd labored over together. "Ben, we need to talk. About us, about what comes next." The conversation Ben had been both dreading and hoping for had finally arrived. In the days since the custody hearing, they'd been carefully polite with each other, professional but distant, as if neither was sure how to bridge the gap between what they'd been building before Marcus's letter and what they might build going forward. "I have something for you," Genevieve said, walking to where she'd left a leather portfolio on the windowsill. "A business proposition." Ben's heart sank. After everything they'd been through, after the letter and the hearing and the tentative steps toward understanding they'd taken in the courthouse, she was offering him more work. Professional distance disguised as opportunity. "Genevieve, if this is about the 90-day requirement about proving stability—" "It's not charity," she interrupted, opening the portfolio and pulling out a set of documents. "It's a legitimate business opportunity, if you're interested." She handed him the papers, and Ben read with growing amazement. It was a business plan for a high-end restoration company, specializing in historic properties and custom woodworking. The financial projections were conservative but promising, the market analysis thorough and professional. "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to be valued for your own merits rather than fitting someone else's prescription," Genevieve said, her voice carefully neutral. "This would be your company, Ben. Your name, your reputation, your decisions. I would be a silent partner, providing initial capital and connections, but the creative and operational control would be entirely yours." Ben stared at the documents, barely able to process what he was seeing. "This is a considerable investment." "It's a smart investment. You're incredibly talented, Ben. I've watched you work, seen the quality of your craftsmanship, observed how you solve problems and manage projects. This region is full of historic properties that need exactly the kind of careful, skilled restoration you can provide." She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, but maintaining the careful distance they'd both been respecting. "More than that," she continued, "this would provide the financial stability you need for Tommy, steady income, health insurance, a professional reputation that would satisfy any family court." Ben looked up from the papers to find her watching him intently. "Why would you do this?" "Because you deserve the chance to build something of your own. Because Tommy deserves to have his father's talents recognized and rewarded appropriately." She paused, her green eyes steady on his. "And because I believe in you, Ben. Not as Marcus's recommended replacement, not as a solution to my loneliness, but as the skilled, principled, extraordinary man you are." The words hit him like a physical force. This wasn't just a business offer, it was Genevieve's way of proving that her feelings for him were separate from her husband's letter, based on her own observations and choices. "There's one condition," she added, and Ben braced himself for the catch he'd been expecting. "You have to want this for yourself, not just as a way to keep Tommy. This offer stands regardless of what happens with the custody situation, regardless of what happens between us personally. I won't have you feeling obligated to me professionally because of anything else. Ben set the papers down on the windowsill and looked out at the estate grounds where he'd spent the happiest working months of his adult life. The offer was generous, more generous than he'd ever dreamed possible. It would solve his financial problems, provide security for Tommy, and give him the professional independence he'd always wanted. But it would also tie him to Genevieve in ways that complicated the already complex emotions between them. "What about us?" he asked quietly. "What about whatever this is that's been growing between us?" Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the grain of the custom cabinet he'd built. "I don't know," she admitted. "I know what I hope for, what I dream about when I let myself think past the fear and the complications. But I also know that Marcus's letter changed things for you, made you question whether my feelings are genuine." She turned to face him fully. "So I'm giving you space to decide. Take the business offer or don't, based purely on whether it's right for your career and Tommy's future. And separately, when you're ready, decide whether you want to explore what might be possible between us." It was, Ben realized, exactly what he'd needed to hear. Genevieve was untangling the professional opportunity from their personal connection, giving him the freedom to choose both or either or neither, without coercion or obligation. "I need time to think about the business proposal," he said. "It's a big decision, and I want to make sure I'm considering all the implications." "Of course, take all the time you need. But I don't need time to think about us." Ben continued, stepping closer to her. "I've been thinking about us for weeks, trying to separate what I felt from what Marcus's letter suggested I should feel. And here's what I know." He reached out to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her smooth skin. "I know that when you laugh at something Tommy says, my heart does things that have nothing to do with anyone's recommendations. I know that watching you discover your artistic abilities has been one of the greatest joys of my adult life. I know that the way you stood up for me in that courtroom came from your heart, not from any letter." Genevieve's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I know that what I feel for you is mine," Ben continued. "It belongs to us, to the conversations we've had, and the work we've done together, and the way you see the best in both Tommy and me. Marcus may have described the kind of man who could make you happy, but he couldn't have known that you'd make me happier than I ever thought possible." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her softly at first, then with growing confidence as she kissed him back. It was a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and old fears finally released, of trust rebuilt and love freely chosen. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "So," Genevieve said, her voice slightly unsteady, "does this mean you're willing to see where this goes?" "I'm willing to build something new with you," Ben said. "Something that honors what came before but belongs entirely to us." Through the window, they could see Tommy playing in the garden with Mrs. Chen, his laughter carrying on the winter air. He was safe, he was loved, and he was exactly where he belonged. The key to the completed guest house was still in Ben's hand, brass warming under his fingers. It represented an ending, but also a beginning, the completion of Marcus's dream and the foundation for whatever they would build together next. 1 year later, Ben stood in the same doorway of the guest house where he'd received Genevieve's business proposal, but everything had changed. The space that had once been Marcus's planned art studio now served a dual-purpose half workshop for Ben's thriving restoration business, half art studio, where Genevieve spent her mornings painting with the natural light that Marcus had designed the windows to capture. The business had exceeded even Genevieve's optimistic projections. Word of Ben's craftsmanship had spread through the network of historic property owners in Virginia and beyond. He had more work than he could handle, a waiting list of clients, and had even hired 2 apprentices to help with the growing demand. More importantly, he had the professional respect and financial security that had seemed impossible just over a year ago. But it was the personal changes that meant the most. "Daddy, is it time yet?" Tommy asked, appearing in the doorway wearing his best button-down shirt and the navy tie that Genevieve had taught him to knot himself. At 9 years old, he'd grown taller and more confident, his autism still part of who he was, but no longer the defining challenge of his daily life. "Almost, buddy," Ben said, adjusting his own tie. "Miss Jen is still getting ready." "She's not Miss Jen anymore," Tommy corrected with the precision that made adults smile. "Today she becomes Mommy Jen." The title had been Tommy's idea, coined during one of the family meetings they'd started having to discuss important changes before they happened. Ben and Genevieve had planned to let Tommy choose what to call her after the wedding, but he'd solved the problem himself with characteristic efficiency. "You're right," Ben said. "Today she becomes Mommy Jen." Through the window, Ben could see the wedding guests gathering in the garden. It was a small ceremony. Mrs. Chen and Dr. Martinez, Sarah Chen and her family, some colleagues from Ben's new business, and Genevieve's brother who'd flown in from California. Even David and Margaret Patterson were there, their relationship with Tommy having evolved into something warm and supportive over the months of supervised visits. The past year had taught all of them that families could be complicated and still be loving, that adding people to a child's life didn't diminish existing bonds, but enriched them. "Ben," Genevieve's voice came from behind them, and both father and son turned to see her standing in the main doorway of the house. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that complemented her auburn hair, which she'd left loose the way Tommy liked it. She wasn't traditionally beautiful in the way that magazine covers defined beauty, but she was radiant with happiness and love, and Ben felt his breath catch, just as it had the first time he'd seen her. "You look beautiful," Tommy announced with his characteristic honesty. "Daddy, doesn't Mommy Jen look beautiful?" "She does," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "She absolutely does." Genevieve walked over to them, and Tommy immediately took her hand in his a gesture that had once required careful negotiation, but now came naturally. "Are you ready for this?" she asked Ben, but her eyes included Tommy in the question. "We're ready," Tommy answered for both of them. "We've been ready for a long time." The ceremony itself was brief and perfect. They'd written their own vows, standing under the oak tree where Genevieve used to read in the afternoons, the same tree that Marcus had positioned the studio windows to frame. Ben spoke about building something new while honoring what came before, about the difference between replacing love and expanding it. Genevieve talked about second chances and the courage to trust in happiness again. But it was Tommy who provided the moment that had everyone reaching for tissues. When the minister asked if anyone had anything to add before the final pronouncement, Tommy raised his hand. "I want to say something," he announced with the seriousness he brought to important occasions. The minister smiled and gestured for him to continue. "Daddy always says that families are people who take care of each other and love each other, even when things are hard." Tommy said, his voice clear and confident, "Mommy Jen takes care of us and loves us, even when I have bad days. And we take care of her and love her even when she gets paint on her good clothes." He paused, considering his words with the care he brought to everything important. "So, I think we've been a family for a long time already. This is just the party to celebrate it." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. After the ceremony, as their guests mingled and shared food that Mrs. Chen had spent days preparing, Ben found himself standing in the guest house again, looking at the family portrait that now occupied the place of honor on the main wall. It showed the three of them in front of their homenot, the grand estate, but the renovated cottage on the property that had become their family residence, big enough for all of them, but cozy enough to feel like home. Marcus's portrait still had a place in their living room, but it was part of a gallery now that included photos of their wedding, pictures of Tommy's school achievements, images of Ben's restoration projects, and Genevieve's paintings. The past was honored, but it no longer overshadowed the present. "No regrets?" Genevieve asked, joining him in the quiet space that had brought them together. "Only one," Ben said, and saw worry flicker across her face. "I regret that it took me so long to knock on your door." She laughed, the sound filling the studio with warmth. "You knocked exactly when you were supposed to. Marcus always said timing was everything in both art and life." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching through the windows as Tommy organized the other children at the wedding into some elaborate game that involved careful arrangements of flowers and leaves. His autism still presented challenges, but it also gave him gifts, a unique way of seeing patterns and possibilities that others missed. "What do you think he'd say?" Ben asked quietly. "Marcus, I mean, about all of this." Genevieve considered the question seriously. "I think he'd be happy that his studio is being used the way he intended as, a place where creativity and love can flourish. I think he'd be proud that we found a way to build something new while keeping his memory alive." She leaned against Ben's shoulder, solid and warm and real. "And I think he'd be glad that his letter accomplished exactly what he hoped it would, not by telling us who to love, but by giving us permission to love again." As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows Marcus had planned and Ben had crafted, illuminating the space where Genevieve now created her art, and Ben refined his business plans, the three of them began their official life as a family. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but something entirely new, built on a foundation of trust, strengthened by shared challenges, and blessed with the kind of love that makes ordinary moments feel like miracles. Outside, Tommy's laughter mixed with the sounds of celebration, and Ben realized that sometimes the best dreams are the ones you never dare to imagine, the ones that find you when you're brave enough to knock on a stranger's door and ask for just one chance to prove your worth. He'd asked for work and found a family. He'd offered his skills and discovered his heart. And in the space between what was planned and what was possible, he'd learned that love doesn't follow blueprints or instructions. It builds itself, one careful choice at a time, into something stronger and more beautiful than anything that could ever be designed. The key to the guest house hung on a hook by the door now, no longer a symbol of completion, but of continuity, a reminder that the best spaces are never truly finished, but always growing, always changing, always ready to hold whatever love brings next. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Sometimes our greatest shame becomes the doorway to our greatest blessing. In the frontier town of Cold Mercy, Preacher Mercer hands his pregnant daughter over to a giant rancher named Cade Rawlins. Everyone thinks it's punishment. Everyone thinks she'll suffer. But Cade does something nobody expects. He treats her with kindness. He gives her safety. He sees her worth when nobody else will. What happens when the man everyone fears becomes the only person who truly loves her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cold Mercy's dusty main street, but there was nothing warm about the light that filtered through the grimy windows of the general store. Mrs. Abernathy pressed her thin lips together as she watched Lila Jane Mercer walk past, her condition now impossible to hide beneath the loose-fitting dress that had once belonged to her mother. "Shameful," she whispered to her husband, loud enough for half the store to hear. "That poor preacher, having to bear such disgrace from his own flesh and blood." Lila kept her chin up as she passed, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. At 19, she had learned to navigate the cruel currents of small-town judgment, but these past months had tested even her strongest reserves. The weight in her belly had grown heavier with each passing week, and with it, the weight of her father's disappointment. Cold Mercy, Montana Territory, had earned its name honestly. Carved from unforgiving wilderness in 1867, the town clung to survival through sheer stubbornness and the kind of moral rigidity that could freeze a man's soul even in summer. The main street stretched barely 4 blocks, lined with weathered storefronts that had seen better days before most folks could remember. At one end stood the Methodist church, its white steeple rising like an accusing finger toward heaven. At the other, the saloon squatted like a toad, drawing the kind of men the good ladies of Cold Mercy pretended not to notice. Between these two poles of salvation and sin, the townspeople lived their careful lives, always mindful of who was watching and what they might say. In a place where winter could kill you, and neighbors were your only lifeline, reputation mattered more than money. A good name could get you credit at the store, help when your roof leaked, or a place by the fire when the wolves came calling. A bad name could leave you dead in a ditch with nobody to mourn your passing. Lila had grown up understanding this delicate balance, raised in the shadow of her father's pulpit, where every word mattered and every action carried the weight of divine judgment. Reverend Isaiah Mercer had built his reputation on moral certitude and righteous fire, delivering sermons that could make grown men weep for their sins and wives examine their own hearts for hidden transgressions. He was a tall man, with silver threading through his dark beard, hands that could thunder against the lectern or comfort the grieving with equal conviction. But those same hands had trembled when Dr. Morrison confirmed what Lila herself had known for weeks. Those same hands had clenched into fists when she refused to name the father, protecting a man who had already fled town without so much as a farewell note. "You have brought shame upon this house," he had said that terrible evening 3 months ago, his voice hollow as a tomb. "Shame upon my ministry, shame upon your mother's memory." The mention of her mother had cut deepest of all. Sarah Beth Mercer had died when Lila was 12, carried off by consumption that no amount of prayer or medicine could touch. She had been the gentle heart of their home, the one who balanced Isaiah's righteousness with tenderness, who read stories by lamplight and pressed wildflowers between the pages of her worn leather Bible. That Bible now sat on Lila's nightstand, its pages yellow with age and marked with her mother's careful notations in the margins. Lila could still remember her mother's voice, soft as summer rain. "Love is patient, my darling. Love is kind. It keeps no record of wrongs." But her father seemed to have forgotten those words, along with so many others that spoke of forgiveness and redemption. The pregnancy had not been born of love, though Lila had thought it might be at the time. Thomas Whitmore had been everything a young woman might dream of in a frontier town, handsome, charming, full of promises about the life they would build together. He had courted her properly for 6 months, attending church services and asking her father's permission to walk her home on Sunday evenings. He spoke of marriage, of a small ceremony in the spring, of children who would grow up knowing both their parents' love. But when autumn came, and her monthly courses did not, Thomas had proven to be made of lesser stuff than his fine words suggested. The very night she told him about the child, he packed his belongings and caught the next stage out of town, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note claiming urgent business in Denver. That had been 7 months ago, and Denver might as well have been the moon for all the chance she had of finding him. Now, as winter loosened its grip on the mountain valleys and spring struggled to assert itself, Lila faced a future as uncertain as the weather. Her father's congregation whispered behind their hands about the preacher's fallen daughter. The ladies of the church auxiliary had stopped inviting her to their quilting circles. Even her oldest friend, Mary Catherine, now crossed the street rather than speak to her in public. The isolation might have broken a weaker spirit, but Lila had inherited more than her mother's Bible. She had her father's backbone, even if she lacked his capacity for cold judgment. She had learned to find comfort in small things, the way morning light fell across her bedroom floor, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden, the movement of life within her womb that reminded her she was not entirely alone. Still, the loneliness cut deep, especially in the long hours after dark, when her father locked himself in his study to prepare sermons about sin and redemption that seemed directed more at his congregation than at his own heart. He had grown distant since her condition became known, speaking to her only when necessary, and then with the formal politeness he might show a stranger seeking charity. The house that had once rung with laughter and heated discussions about Scripture now felt like a tomb. Meals passed in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware against china. Evening prayers had dwindled to perfunctory mutterings that carried no warmth, no hope, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting across from him had once been the apple of his eye. It was in this atmosphere of cold disappointment that Lila first heard the name Cade Rawlins spoken in connection with her future. She had been returning from the mercantile, her arms full of supplies for the evening meal, when she caught fragments of conversation drifting from her father's study. "Practical solution to your problem, Reverend," came a voice she recognized as belonging to Mayor Hutchins. "Man like that, he's used to taking care of strays." "I will not have my daughter treated as livestock," her father replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Now, Isaiah, you know Cade's got a good reputation for treating his animals fair. Never heard tell of him being cruel to anything under his care. And Lord knows the man could use some company out there on that spread of his." Lila pressed herself against the hallway wall. Packages clutched to her chest, straining to hear more. Cade Rawlins was a name everyone in Cold Mercy knew, though few could claim to know the man himself. He owned a substantial ranch 15 miles north of town, running cattle and horses on land that stretched from the valley floor to the tree line. Folks said he was a veteran of the war between the states, that he had seen things that left him preferring the company of animals to people. He came to town perhaps once a month for supplies, a giant of a man who moved with surprising quiet for his size. Children stared at him from behind their mothers' skirts, and grown men stepped aside when he walked past. Not from fear, exactly, but from the kind of respect reserved for forces of nature, thunderstorms, avalanches, and men who carried their grief like boulders on their shoulders. "He's a good Christian man," Mayor Hutchins continued, "pays his bills, keeps to himself, never caused trouble for anyone, and he's got that big house sitting empty except for himself." "What you're suggesting is barbaric," her father said, but again there was that telltale hesitation that spoke of a man grasping for solutions to an impossible problem. "What I'm suggesting is practical. The girl needs somewhere to go, and you need your reputation intact. Cade needs, well, Lord knows what Cade needs, but he's got the space and the means to provide for her. Might work out better than you think." Lila had heard enough. She crept back to the kitchen and set about preparing dinner with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The conversation continued in the study for another hour, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of negotiation. By the time her father called her to set the table, she could see in his eyes that some decision had been reached. But it would be 3 more days before he found the courage to tell her what that decision was. 3 days during which the weight of unspoken words hung over their house like smoke from a distant fire. 3 days during which Lila watched her father wrestle with his conscience and saw that conscience lose the battle, piece by piece, to his pride and his fear of what the town might say if he kept her under his roof much longer. When he finally spoke the words that would change her life forever, they would come not as a father's love seeking the best for his child, but as a preacher's judgment seeking the preservation of his own salvation. And Lila would learn that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in the language of necessity, delivered by those who claim to love us most. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning, when the March wind carried the promise of spring, but still held winter's bite. Lila was hanging laundry behind the house, her movements careful and deliberate, as her pregnancy had grown more pronounced with each passing week. The sheets snapped like flags of surrender in the gusting air, and she paused to press a hand to her lower back, where a persistent ache had settled. "Lila Jane." Her father's voice cut through the morning stillness with the same authority he used to call his congregation to repentance. "Come inside. We need to talk." She knew from his tone that the time for avoiding difficult conversations had passed. The way he stood in the doorway, his shoulders set and his mouth drawn into a hard line, told her that whatever decision had been brewing in his study these past days was about to be delivered like a final judgment. Inside the parlor, 2 men waited beside her father. Mayor Hutchins sat in the good chair, his hat balanced on his knees, and his face wearing the careful neutrality of a man conducting unpleasant business. The other man she recognized, but had never formally met Cade Rawlins himself, standing near the window, with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on something far beyond the glass. He was even larger than she remembered from her glimpses of him in town, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that stretched the seams of his worn work shirt. His hair was dark brown, touched with grey at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent his days under the open sky. But it was his hands that drew her attention, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, yet somehow gentle in the way he held his hat, as if he understood that even inanimate objects deserved careful treatment. "Sit down, daughter." Her father's voice had taken on the formal cadence he used for serious church business. "Mr. Rawlins and I have reached an understanding about your situation." Lila lowered herself into the chair across from Mayor Hutchins, her heart beginning to race as the full implications of what was happening became clear. "My situation? Your condition has become a source of considerable difficulty for this household," her father continued, pacing behind his chair like a prosecutor before a jury. "As a man of God, I have a responsibility to my congregation, to this community, and to the reputation of the church itself. Your presence here, in your current state, undermines my ability to minister effectively to those who look to me for moral guidance." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage while maintaining the veneer of righteousness. "Father, I have prayed about this extensively," he cut her off, his voice growing stronger, as if drawing power from the familiar rhythms of moral certitude. "And I believe the Lord has provided a solution that serves everyone's best interests. Mr. Rawlins has graciously agreed to take responsibility for you until such time as your situation resolves itself." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Lila stared at her father, waiting for him to explain that this was some elaborate joke, that the man who had raised her and taught her about God's love would never actually sell his own daughter like a piece of unwanted furniture. But his eyes held no warmth, no regret, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting before him had ever been anything more than an inconvenient burden to be disposed of. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "You can't just give me away." "I can and I will," her father replied with the finality of scripture. "Mr. Rawlins has agreed to provide for your needs until the child is born. After that, arrangements can be made for its care and your future." Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Lila, this is really for the best. Mr. Rawlins has a fine spread up north, plenty of room, and he's a God-fearing man who'll see you're treated proper." For the first time since entering the room, Cade Rawlins spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Begging your pardon, Mayor, but I think the lady should hear this from me direct." He turned from the window to face her, and Lila was startled by the kindness she saw in his dark eyes. They were the color of rich earth after rain, and they held none of the judgment or calculation she had grown accustomed to seeing in the faces around town. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice was gentle despite its depth, "I want you to know that this arrangement, if you agree to it, will be conducted with all the respect and propriety you deserve. You'll have your own room in the main house, your own space to do as you please. I won't ask anything of you except to let me provide for your needs until you decide what you want to do next." "And if I refuse?" Lila asked, though she already knew the answer from the set of her father's jaw. "Then you're welcome to seek shelter wherever you can find it," her father said coldly. "But you will not do so under my roof or with my name to protect you." The cruelty of it took her breath away. In that moment, she saw her father clearly, for perhaps the first Timino, as the righteous man of God she had always believed him to be, but as a weak man whose pride mattered more than his daughter's welfare, whose reputation meant more than the child he had raised and claimed to love. Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There are papers to be signed, of course, legal documents transferring responsibility and such. Nothing permanent, you understand, just until the situation stabilizes." "Papers," Lila repeated numbly. The words seemed to echo in the small room, reducing her entire existence to lines of ink on parchment. "It's all perfectly legal and proper," Mayor Hutchins assured her, producing a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Mr. Rawlins assumes responsibility for your care and maintenance, and in return receives certain considerations regarding your welfare and that of the child." Cade Rawlins stepped forward, his expression darkening. "Now hold on there, Mayor. We never discussed any considerations about the child. That's not what I agreed to. Well, naturally, if you're providing for the mother, there are certain expectations. The only expectation, Cade interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both other men pause, is that I provide a safe place for this young lady to have her baby in peace. Nothing more, nothing less. He looked directly at Lila then, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in months: genuine concern for her well-being, rather than worry about what her presence might cost him. "Miss Mercer," he said carefully, "if you're willing to come stay at my place, I promise you'll be treated with respect. You'll have privacy, comfort, and safety for as long as you need it. And when you're ready to decide what comes next, that'll be your choice to make, not mine or anyone else's." The room fell silent again, as everyone waited for her response. Lila looked around at the faces surrounding her father's cold determination, Mayor Hutchins' bureaucratic discomfort, and Cade Rawlins' unexpected compassion. The choice, such as it was, seemed absurdly simple. She could stay and continue to endure her father's contempt and the town's whispered condemnation, growing heavier and more isolated with each passing day until the birth itself became just another source of shame to be hidden away. Or she could take a chance on the kindness she saw in a stranger's eyes, trusting that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. "I'll need to pack my things," she said quietly. Her father nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of business concluded and burdens lifted. "Mr. Rawlins will return for you tomorrow morning. Be ready." As the men filed out of the parlor to complete their arrangements, Lila remained in her chair, one hand resting on her belly, where her child stirred restlessly, as if sensing the monumental change that was coming. Through the window, she could see Cade Rawlins speaking quietly with her father near the front gate, and she caught fragments of his words carried on the wind. "I'll build her a room with windows," he was saying, and something in his tone suggested this was both a promise and a warning. "She'll want to see the sky." For the first time in months, Lila felt something stirring in her chest that might have been hope. The journey to Cade Rawlins' ranch took most of the morning, winding through mountain passes where snow still clung to the shadows and early wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color. Lila sat beside him on the wagon seat, her few possessions secured in the back alongside supplies from town, and tried not to think about how thoroughly her life had changed in the space of 24 hours. Cade drove with the easy competence of a man comfortable with horses and distance, speaking little but pointing out landmarks along the way: a creek where elk came to drink, a stand of aspen trees that turned gold in autumn, a rocky outcropping where eagles nested each spring. His voice when he spoke was gentle, free of the judgment she had grown accustomed to hearing in town. "That's my north pasture," he said as they crested a hill, and the ranch spread out below them. "Cattle winter there mostly, though I move them up higher come summer." Lila gazed down at the valley with something approaching wonder. The ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that sparkled in the morning sun. It was larger than she had expected, built of logs and stone, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the light like welcoming eyes. Outbuildings dotted the property: a barn, corrals, a chicken coop, and what looked like a workshop, all connected by well-worn paths and rail fences that spoke of careful maintenance and pride in the work. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. Cade glanced at her with surprise, as if he had expected criticism rather than appreciation. "Gets lonely sometimes, but it's good land. Been in my family since before the war." As they drew closer to the house, Lila could see more details that spoke to the character of the man beside her. The porch railings were carved with intricate patterns that suggested long winter evenings spent with careful hands and sharp tools. Flower boxes beneath the windows held the stubble of last year's plantings, waiting for someone to coax new life from their soil. A vegetable garden plot had been prepared for spring planting, the soil dark and rich and ready. "I've got the room ready for you," Cade said as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle and brief in their contact. "It's got windows facing east and south, so you'll get good light most of the day." The interior of the house was as carefully maintained as the exterior, with wide plank floors polished smooth by years of use and furniture that spoke of quality rather than showiness. Quilts hung over chairbacks, and the stone fireplace showed signs of regular use. Books lined shelves built into the walls, and Lila caught titles that suggested a man of broader interests than his quiet demeanor might indicate. "Kitchen's through there," Cade said, setting her bags down near the staircase. "You're welcome to anything you need. I usually eat simple meat, bread, whatever vegetables I can manage from the garden, but if you know how to cook different, I'd be grateful for the change." He led her upstairs to a room that took her breath away. It was larger than her bedroom at home, with windows on two walls that looked out over the valley and mountains beyond. A quilt covered the bed, and someone, Cade, she realized, had placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the dresser, their yellow petals bright against the dark wood. But it was the piece of furniture in the corner that made her eyes fill with unexpected tears. A wooden cradle sat there, clearly handmade, with sides carved in the same intricate patterns she had noticed on the porch railings. The wood was smooth as silk, sanded and oiled until it gleamed, and lined with soft fabric that looked suspiciously like it had been cut from one of the quilts downstairs. "You made this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cade shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his big hands twisting the brim of his hat. "Figured you might need it come time. It's nothing fancy, but it's solid. Should last." Lila reached out to touch the smooth wood, overwhelmed by this evidence of thoughtfulness from a man who barely knew her. In town, people crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her condition. Her own father spoke of her pregnancy as a problem to be solved, rather than a life to be welcomed. But this stranger had spent hours crafting something beautiful for a child he would never claim, simply because he saw a need and chose to fill it. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said, and meant every word. "I'll leave you to get settled," Cade said, backing toward the door with the awkward haste of a man unaccustomed to emotional displays. "Supper's usually around 6, but don't feel obliged. You can eat when you want, sleep when you want. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." After he left, Lila sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that was somehow already more welcoming than the house where she had spent 19 years. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming her face and highlighting dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. For the first time in months, she felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of fear and shame that had grown so familiar. She had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. That evening, she ventured downstairs to find Cade in the kitchen, wrestling with what appeared to be an ambitious attempt at biscuits. Flour dusted his shirt and the counter, and the expression on his face suggested that cooking was not among his natural talents. "Might I help?" she offered, and at his grateful nod, she took over the preparation while he set the table with the careful precision of a man determined to do things properly. They ate by lamplight, speaking little but comfortably, like old friends who didn't need words to fill every silence. Cade asked about her preferences for breakfast, whether she liked her coffee strong or weak, if there were foods that disagreed with her condition. Simple questions, practical concerns, but underneath them lay a consideration for her welfare that warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. "Thank you," she said as they finished the meal, "for all of this, for the room, the cradle, for treating me like a person deserving of respect." Cade finished quietly. "That's not something you should have to thank anyone for, Miss Mercer. That's just how things ought to be." That night, Lila lay in her new bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling around hearth, creak of wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the mountain sky like scattered diamonds, and for the first time since learning about her pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held something more than shame and sorrow. In the room below, she could hear Cade moving around the kitchen, banking the fire, and securing the house for the night. The sounds were comforting rather than intrusive, the careful actions of a man taking responsibility for those under his protection. When all was quiet, She placed her hand on her belly, where her child rested, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for whatever providence had led her to this place, to this man who saw her worth when she had almost forgotten it herself. Spring arrived at the ranch with gentle insistence, coaxing green shoots from the dark earth and filling the air with the promise of renewal. Lila had been there 2 weeks, and each day brought small revelations about the man who had taken her in and the life they were cautiously building together. She had discovered that Cade rose before dawn, moving through the house with surprising quiet for such a large man, always careful not to wake her as he prepared for the day's work. By the time she made her way downstairs, coffee would be waiting on the stove and eggs gathering in a basket by the back door, evidence of his morning rounds through the chicken coop. "You don't have to cook for me," he had said that first week, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes when she insisted on taking over the kitchen duties. It gave her purpose, a way to contribute to the household that didn't involve charity or pity. This morning, like the others, she found him in the vegetable garden plot behind the house, turning soil that had been waiting all winter for attention. His shirt was already damp with perspiration despite the cool air, and dirt clung to his hands and forearms as he worked the stubborn earth into neat rows. "What will you plant?" she asked, settling carefully on the porch steps where she could watch him work. "The usual: potatoes, beans, carrots, onions, whatever keeps well through winter." He paused in his digging to look at her. "You have thoughts on the matter?" The question surprised her. Thomas had never asked her opinion about anything more substantial than what dress to wear to church. Her father made pronouncements rather than seeking input, but Cade seemed genuinely interested in her answer. "My mother used to grow herbs," she said, remembering Sarah Beth's small garden behind the parsonage. "Sage and thyme, parsley and dill. She said they made even simple food taste like celebration." "Herbs would be good," Cade agreed, resuming his work. "Haven't had much call for them, cooking just for myself, but I reckon that's about to change." Later that morning, Lila found a packet of wildflower seeds in the supply closet, clearly forgotten from some previous spring's ambitious plans. Without asking permission, she claimed a corner of the garden plot and scattered the seeds with the same faith her mother had shown in her herb garden trust, that something beautiful could grow from the simplest beginnings. As the days lengthened and warmed, she found herself venturing farther from the house, exploring the ranch with the careful steps of someone learning to trust her feet again. Cade had introduced her to the animals with the formal courtesy he might use for distinguished guests. There was Duchess, an ancient milk cow with wise eyes and a gentle disposition. The horses, Thunder, Belle, and Smoku, came to the fence when she approached, curious about this new presence in their domain. "They're good judges of character," Cade had said, watching Belle nuzzle Lila's palm in search of treats. "Animals know things about people that people sometimes miss about themselves." The chickens proved to be the most entertaining, a collection of hens with distinct personalities, and a rooster named Napoleon who took his responsibilities seriously. Lila discovered that gathering eggs could be either a peaceful meditation or a military operation, depending on Napoleon's mood and whether he deemed her worthy of access to his ladies. "He's protective," Cade explained after Napoleon had chased her from the coop in a flurry of indignant squawking. "Can't fault him for that." In the evenings, after the animals were tended and the day's work complete, they fell into a comfortable routine of shared meals and quiet conversation. Cade proved to be a better listener than talker, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged her to speak about things she had kept locked away for months. "You miss teaching," he observed one evening, as she described her work at the small school in Cold Mercy, before her condition made it impossible to continue. "I miss the children," she said, surprised by how much the admission hurt. "They didn't care about my circumstances. They just wanted to learn their letters and hear stories." "You could teach again," Cade said carefully. "When you're ready. There are always children who need learning, and not all of them are lucky enough to live in towns with proper schools." The possibility had never occurred to her. In her father's house, her pregnancy had felt like an ending, the conclusion of all her dreams and aspirations. But here, Watching the sun set over the valley while her child stirred restlessly in her womb, she could almost imagine a different kind of future. "Tell me about the war," she said one evening, recognizing in his eyes the same shadows she had seen in other veterans who had passed through Cold Mercy. Cade was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories too heavy for one man to bear alone. "Lost a lot of good men," he said simply. "Came home to find I'd lost my wife too. Consumption took her while I was gone, and nobody thought to write and tell me until it was too late for goodbyes." The pain in his voice made her chest tighten with sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He stared into the fire for a moment before continuing. "Used to think this place was too quiet, too empty, but quiet's not so bad when it's the right kind of quiet. When it's peaceful instead of just hollow." She understood what he meant. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than judgment. It was the kind of quiet that came from shared understanding, from two people who had both learned that life could disappoint you in ways you never expected, but still surprise you with unexpected grace. "Cade," she said, using his name for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "Why did you agree to take me in? Really?" He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious and honest. "Because nobody deserves to be thrown away like rubbish, especially not when they're carrying life. And because this place needed someone who could see its beauty instead of just its loneliness." That night, as she watched her wildflower seeds beginning to sprout in neat green rows, Lila realized that something was growing inside her too, not just the child she carried, but hope itself, taking root in soil that had seemed barren just weeks before. For the first time since leaving her father's house, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The discovery came by accident on a warm May morning when Lila was helping Cade organize his cluttered desk in search of receipts for the tax assessor. She had been staying at the ranch for 6 weeks, and their easy partnership had extended to household tasks that he had clearly been neglecting for years. "You keep your important papers in the oddest places," she said, pulling a deed from between the pages of a veterinary manual. "How do you ever find anything?" "I mostly don't," Cade admitted, sorting through a stack of correspondence that dated back several years. "Never was much good at the business side of ranching. I just know how to work the land and care for the animals." It was while reaching for a ledger on the highest shelf that her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small wooden box pushed far back behind the books. When she brought it down, Cade's entire body went still, his face draining of color as he recognized what she held. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, seeing his distress. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he said, though his voice had gone hoarse. "I'd forgotten it was there." The box was made of the same fine wood as her cradle, polished smooth by handling and age. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a military medallion bronze star, she realized, recognizing it from illustrations she had seen in newspapers during the war. Beneath it was a small daguerreotype of a young woman with gentle eyes and a smile that spoke of quiet happiness. "Your wife," Lila said softly, not a question, but a statement of understanding. "Mary Elizabeth." Cade's voice was barely above a whisper. She was. She was everything good about this place, everything I was fighting to come home to. Lila studied the photograph, seeing in the woman's face the kind of serene beauty that came from deep contentment rather than mere physical features. This was someone who had been truly loved, truly cherished, and the knowledge of what Cade had lost made her heart ache for him. She would have been a wonderful mother, she said, instinctively understanding that this was at the heart of his grief. She wanted children more than anything, Cade confirmed, taking the photograph with reverent care. "We tried for 3 years before I left for the war. She was so sure that by the time I came home, but the consumption took that dream along with everything else." "Tell me about her," Lila said, settling into the chair across from him. "What was she like?" For a moment she thought he would refuse, but then something in his expression softened, as if he had been waiting years for someone to ask that question. "She laughed at everything," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Used to say that life was too hard to waste time being grim about it. She could find joy in the smallest things: a butterfly in the garden, a good crop of tomatoes, the way morning light fell across our kitchen table. As he spoke, Lila could see Mary Elizabeth taking shape in her mind, a woman who had filled this house with warmth and laughter, who had made Cade believe in possibilities beyond mere survival. No wonder the place had felt hollow to him after her death. No wonder he had retreated into solitude rather than try to rebuild what they had shared. "She sounds wonderful," Lila said, meaning it completely. "She was, and she would have liked you." Cade looked up from the photograph to meet her eyes. "She would have said you had a strong spirit, that you'd survived things that would have broken lesser women. She always could see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house, unusual enough to make them both look toward the window with concern. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and unannounced visitors were virtually unheard of. "Stay here," Cade said, but Lila was already moving toward the window to peer through the curtains. 3 men sat on horseback in the yard, their clothes marking them as townspeople rather than neighboring ranchers. She recognized one of them, Dr. Morrison, who had confirmed her pregnancy what seemed like a lifetime ago. The other 2 were strangers, but their bearing suggested official business of some kind. "Dr. Morrison's here," she said, her stomach clenching with sudden anxiety. "With 2 men I don't recognize." Cade cursed under his breath, carefully placing his wife's photograph back in its box. "Probably the territorial health inspector and a deputy marshal. I was wondering when they'd show up." "What do they want?" "To make sure you're being treated properly, I'd guess. Your father's been getting questions from the church hierarchy about his daughter's sudden disappearance. Had to provide some kind of official explanation." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. "They want to take me back." "Not if I have anything to say about it." Cade's voice carried a quiet determination that reminded her of the military bearing she could sometimes glimpse beneath his civilian gentleness. "But they'll want to inspect the arrangements, ask questions, make sure everything's legal and proper." The knock on the front door was firm and official. Cade straightened his shoulders and walked to answer it, every inch the respectable rancher welcoming unexpected guests. Lila heard the murmur of voices, formal introductions, the kind of careful politeness that preceded difficult conversations. "Miss Mercer," Dr. Morrison said as she entered the parlor, his tone professionally neutral. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison, I'm feeling very well." The health inspector, a thin man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the demeanor of someone who found fault with everything he examined, looked around the room with obvious skepticism. "I am Inspector Hartwell from the territorial capital. We've received complaints about the irregular nature of your living arrangements here." "Complaints from whom?" Cade asked, though they all knew the answer. "Concerned citizens who question whether proper moral standards are being maintained," the deputy marshal said. He was younger than the others, with the nervous energy of a man eager to prove his authority. "There are laws about unmarried persons of opposite genders cohabitating, especially when one party is in a delicate condition." "Miss Mercer has her own quarters," Cade said evenly. "She receives proper care and supervision. I fail to see what laws might be violated by Christian charity." "Christian charity is one thing," Inspector Hartwell said, producing a notebook and pencil. "But the appearance of impropriety is quite another. I'll need to examine the living arrangements and speak with Miss Mercer privately to ensure she is here of her own free will." The next hour passed in a blur of questions, inspections, and barely concealed accusations. The men examined her room, questioned her about her daily routine, and asked pointed questions about the nature of her relationship with Cade that made her face burn with embarrassment and anger. Through it all, Cade remained calm and respectful, answering their inquiries with the patience of a man who had nothing to hide. But Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when they implied that he might be taking advantage of her vulnerable situation. "Everything appears to be in order," Dr. Morrison said finally, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely pleased with this conclusion. "Miss Mercer seems to be receiving adequate care." "More than adequate," she said firmly. finding her voice at last. "Mr. Rawlins has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. I am here by choice, and I am grateful for his protection." The words seemed to surprise them, as if they had expected to find a frightened, mistreated woman grateful for rescue. Instead, they found someone who spoke with quiet dignity about her circumstances and clear appreciation for the man who had given her sanctuary. After they left, Lila and Cade sat in the parlor, both drained by the encounter. The medal and photograph still lay on the desk between them, reminders of the conversation that had been interrupted by official scrutiny. "This won't be the end of it," Cade said quietly. "Your father's not going to let this rest. He needs to prove that his decision was righteous, that you're being properly managed." "Then what do we do?" Cade looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shifting in his expression, a decision being made, a line being drawn. "We make sure they have nothing to complain about," he said. "We make this arrangement so respectable, so unquestionably proper, that even your father can't find fault with it." Lila had the distinct feeling that he was talking about something more than just maintaining separate quarters and observing social proprieties. But whatever plan was forming in his mind, she trusted him to handle it with the same careful consideration he had shown her from the very beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, delivered by a rider who wouldn't meet Lila's eyes as he handed over the envelope. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized with a sinking, heart-bold, confident strokes that had once seemed romantic but now felt like a threat. Thomas Whitmore had found her. Lila sat on the porch steps, the unopened letter trembling in her hands as she watched the messenger disappear down the valley road. Her child had grown active in recent weeks, responding to her moods with restless movement that reminded her constantly of the life she carried and the choices that lay ahead. "Bad news?" Cade asked, emerging from the barn where he had been shoeing one of the horses. He took one look at her face and set down his tools, his expression darkening with concern. "It's from Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the father of my child." Cade's entire body went still, the way she had seen him react when a storm was approaching, or when something had spooked the cattle. "What does he want?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it yet." She stared at the envelope, as if it might burst into flames at any moment. "I thought he was gone forever. It's been almost 8 months since he left." "Maybe we should read it together," Cade suggested gently, settling beside her on the steps. "Whatever it says, you don't have to face it alone." With shaking fingers, Lila broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Thomas's handwriting filled a single page, the words as careless and self-serving as the man who had written them. "My dear Lila," she read aloud, her voice growing steadier with anger. "I have recently learned of your situation and current circumstances through mutual acquaintances in Denver. I must say I am disturbed to hear that you have taken up residence with a stranger rather than waiting for my return to properly address our situation." Cade made a sound low in his throat that might have been a growl. "Our situation? The man abandons you and then has the nerve to claim ownership." Lila continued reading, each word stoking the fire of her indignation. "I have concluded my business affairs here and am prepared to return to Cold Mercy to claim what is rightfully mine. I expect you to conduct yourself with appropriate discretion until I arrive to make the necessary arrangements for our marriage and the proper raising of my child." "His child," Cade repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "There's more." Lila's hands were shaking again, but with fury rather than fear. "I trust you will see the wisdom of ending your current inappropriate arrangement immediately. A woman in your condition should not be living in sin with a man who has no legal claim to her welfare. I will arrive by the end of the month to collect you and make proper provision for our family." The letter was signed with Thomas's full name and a flourish that suggested he considered the matter settled by his mere declaration of intent. For several minutes they sat in silence, the weight of Thomas's presumption settling between them like a stone. The morning that had begun with such peaceful promise now felt charged with the threat of upheaval. of having the careful sanctuary they had built together torn apart by a man who had forfeited any right to claim either Lila or her child. He thinks he can just waltz back here and pick up where he left off. Lila said finally, her voice tight with controlled rage. As if the past 8 months never happened. As if I've been sitting here like some faithful dog waiting for him to remember I exist. What do you want to do? Cade asked, and the question surprised her with its simplicity. Not what she should do, or what was proper, or what others might expect what she wanted. I want to burn this letter and pretend I never received it, she said honestly. I want Thomas Whitmore to disappear, back to wherever he came from, and leave us in peace. Us, Cade repeated softly, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. Cade, She stopped, realizing what she had revealed in her moment of emotional honesty. I didn't mean to presume. You weren't presuming anything, he said, his dark eyes serious and intent. These past months, watching you bloom here, watching you find your strength again, it's been like seeing the ranch come back to life. You belong here, Lila. Not because of some legal arrangement or charitable obligation, but because this place needs you the way the earth needs rain. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch could have been. Lila felt her heart racing, not with fear but with a recognition that had been building for weeks, the understanding that what had begun as rescue had grown into something far deeper and more precious. But Thomas has legal rights, she said, trying to be practical, even as her heart yearned toward the possibility Cade was offering. He is the father, and unmarried women have few protections under the law. Legal rights can be challenged, Cade said firmly. A man who abandons a woman when she needs him most, who leaves her to face shame and hardship alone, that's not a father. That's just a man who happened to plant a seed. The fierce protectiveness in his voice reminded her of Napoleon defending his hens, but there was something more here, a depth of caring that went beyond mere chivalry or duty. What are you saying, Cade? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley where their wildflowers had begun to bloom in brilliant patches of color among the green grass. When he spoke, his words were careful, deliberate, weighted with significance. I'm saying that if you were my wife, legally and properly, Thomas Whitmore would have no claim on you or your child. I'm saying that what we've built here doesn't have to end just because some fool finally remembered his responsibilities. Lila's breath caught in her throat. Are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking if you'd consider it, Cade said, turning to face her fully. Not because you need protection, though I'd be honored to provide it. Not because it would solve our immediate problem, though it would. I'm asking because somewhere, in these past months, watching you plant flowers and teach Napoleon proper manners and turn this house back into a home, I fell in love with you. The words seemed to hang in the morning air like music, beautiful and unexpected and perfect in their simplicity. Lila looked at this man who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself, who was offering not just his name and protection, but his heart. I love you too, she whispered, the admission feeling like a prayer. I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to hope. Hope's not something to be afraid of, Cade said, reaching for her hands with the gentle reverence she had come to associate with all his gestures toward her. Not when it's grounded in truth. He leaned forward then, slowly and carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she instead tilted her face up toward his, he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of patience and deep affection rather than mere passion. We'll need to act quickly, he said when they broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. If Thomas is planning to arrive by month's end, we should be married before then. Make it impossible for him to challenge our legal standing. The preacher in town won't marry us, Cade finished grimly. Not with your father's opposition and the questions about your condition, but there's a circuit judge who comes through Copper Falls once a month. Judge Harrison, he's a fair man, more concerned with justice than appearances. As they sat together planning their future, Lila felt the last of her fears dissolving like morning mist. Thomas's letter, which had seemed like such a threat, just minutes ago, now felt like nothing more than the desperate bluster of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman, but as Lila Rawlins' wife, partner, and beloved companion to a man who had shown her what true love looked like. The journey to Copper Falls took most of the day, winding through mountain passes that Lila had never seen before. She sat beside Cade on the wagon seat, wearing her mother's best dress navy blue with tiny pearl buttons that she had let out as much as possible to accommodate her condition. In her lap she held a small bouquet of wildflowers from their garden, the same varieties she had planted that first hopeful morning at the ranch. Judge Harrison proved to be a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the practical manner of someone who had spent his career dealing with the realities of frontier life rather than its idealized version. His temporary courthouse was the back room of the Copper Falls Hotel, where he conducted business with the efficient dignity of a man who understood that legal ceremonies should be meaningful rather than merely formal. "Mr. Rawlins, Miss Mercer," he said, looking up from the papers Cade had presented. "I understand you wish to be married today." "Yes, sir," Cade replied, his hand finding Lila's with gentle reassurance. "We have the license and witnesses." The witnesses were the hotel proprietor and his wife, strangers who had agreed to serve in this capacity with the casual kindness that frontier communities showed to those in need of assistance. They stood quietly in the corner, respectful of the solemnity of the moment. "Miss Mercer," Judge Harrison said, his tone gentle but direct, "are you entering into this marriage of your own free will, without coercion or undue influence?" "I am," Lila said firmly, meaning every word. "And you understand that marriage is a legal contract with responsibilities and obligations that cannot be easily dissolved?" "We do," they answered together. The ceremony itself was simple but dignified, the judge's words carrying the weight of law and tradition without unnecessary elaboration. When Cade slipped a simple gold band onto her finger run he had purchased that morning from the general store, Lila felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman. She was Lila Rawlins, wife and partner to a man who loved her. The ride home was peaceful, filled with the comfortable silence of two people who had just made a momentous decision and found it good. The late afternoon sun painted the valley in shades of gold and green, and their ranch, their home, looked more beautiful than ever as they crested the final hill. But as they drew closer to the house, Lila noticed something that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. 3 horses stood tied to the front porch rail, and smoke rose from the chimney despite the warm weather signs of visitors who had made themselves at home in their absence. "Stay close to me," Cade said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to check the rifle secured beneath the wagon seat. They were still 50 yards from the house when the front door opened and 3 men emerged onto the porch. Thomas Whitmore led the group, looking every inch the successful businessman in his fine clothes and polished boots. Behind him came Mayor Hutchins, his face wearing the careful neutrality of a politician trying to navigate troubled waters. The third man was a stranger well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Lila," Thomas called out as if greeting a beloved friend rather than the woman he had abandoned 8 months earlier. "Thank God you're safe. When I arrived and found you missing, I feared the worst." Cade brought the wagon to a stop in front of the porch, his body radiating the controlled tension of a man preparing for conflict. "Whitmore, I wasn't expecting you for another week. I was able to conclude my business earlier than anticipated," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on Lila with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I came as soon as I received word about Lila's situation." "Her situation is perfectly respectable," Cade said evenly, helping Lila down from the wagon with careful attention to her condition. "Living in sin with a stranger while carrying my child." Thomas's voice carried the righteous indignation of a man who had convinced himself he was the injured party. "I think not." "Actually," Lila said, finding her voice and her courage, "my situation is that of a properly married woman, Mr. Rawlins and I were wed this afternoon by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls." The silence that followed her announcement was so complete that she could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and finally a rage so pure it made his features ugly. "Impossible," he sputtered. "You can't marry someone else while carrying my child. It's not legal, it's not moral." "It's perfectly legal," the stranger said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am attorney Charles Brennan from Denver. Mr. Whitmore engaged my services to ensure the proper resolution of this matter. However, if what you say is true, Mrs. Rawlins, is it? Then the situation has become considerably more complex." Cade reached into his jacket and produced their marriage certificate, the ink still fresh and the judge's seal clearly visible. "Mrs. Rawlins is my wife in every legal sense. Her previous relationship with Mr. Whitmore, whatever its nature, was never formalized through marriage. He has no legal claim on her whatsoever." Attorney Brennan examined the document with the thoroughness of a man trained to find flaws in legal proceedings. After several minutes, he looked up with obvious frustration. "The marriage appears to be entirely valid. Mr. Whitmore, I'm afraid your position has become untenable." "My position?" Thomas's voice rose to something approaching a shout. "That's my child she's carrying, my blood. You can't tell me I have no rights to my own offspring." "Actually, I can," Brennan said with professional detachment. "Under territorial law, a child born in wedlock is presumed to be the child of the husband, regardless of the biological circumstances. Mrs. Rawlins' child will be legally considered Mr. Rawlins' child from the moment of birth." The implications of this hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been so confident in his righteousness, so certain that his mere appearance would resolve everything in his favor, that he hadn't considered the possibility that Lila might have moved beyond waiting for his return. "This is outrageous," he declared, turning to Mayor Hutchins as if expecting support. "You can't allow this travesty to stand. The woman was practically given to this man like property. The marriage is clearly a sham, designed to prevent me from claiming what's rightfully mine." "Now see here, young man," Mayor Hutchins said uncomfortably, "the Rawlins marriage may have been sudden, but it appears to be entirely legal. And given your own absence during the lady's time of need, I'm not sure you're in a position to make demands." Lila watched this exchange with growing amazement. For months, she had lived in fear of this confrontation, imagining Thomas as a figure of overwhelming authority who could sweep back into her life and reclaim control. Instead, she saw him for what he really was, selfish man who had expected the world to remain frozen in place while he pursued his own interests. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had found her strength, "you made your choice 8 months ago when you left me to face this alone. I've made mine today. Mr. Rawlins, me husband, has shown me more kindness and respect in 3 months than you managed in 6 months of courtship. But the child will be raised by parents who love and want it." Lila interrupted firmly, "By a father who carved its cradle with his own hands and a mother who will teach it that real love means staying, even when times are difficult." Thomas looked around the group, seeking any ally in his cause, but found only faces that ranged from hostile to merely unsympathetic. Even Attorney Brennan, despite being paid for his services, seemed to recognize the futility of challenging a legal marriage based on moral outrage alone. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "I'll find a way to challenge this mockery. That child belongs to me." "No," Cade said, speaking for the first time since presenting their marriage certificate. His voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of a man defending his family. "That child belongs to the family that wants it, protects it, and will love it every day of its life. You're not part of that family, Whitmore. You never were." As the 3 men prepared to leave, defeated in their mission but unwilling to acknowledge it gracefully, Lila felt a profound sense of completion. The future she had feared for so many months, a future dominated by shame, obligation, and loveless duty, had been replaced by something infinitely better. She was Mrs. Rawlins now, partner to a man who had proven his love through action rather than words, mother to a child who would grow up knowing security and acceptance rather than shame. And as she watched Thomas Whitmore ride away, disappearing into the gathering twilight like the bad dream he had always been, she knew that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting, but from choosing a different battlefield entirely. The weeks following Thomas's departure brought an unexpected peace to the ranch, as if the very air had been cleansed of the tension that had hung over them since his letter arrived. Lila settled into her new role as Mrs. Rawlins with a contentment that surprised her in its completeness. The gold band on her finger caught the morning light as she gathered eggs, and she found herself pausing to admire it not for its modest beauty, but for what it represented. She was no longer alone. More than that, she was truly wanted. July brought the full heat of summer to the valley, and with it, the constant activity of a working ranch. Lila had grown large with child, her movements careful but determined as she refused to let her condition render her useless. Cade worried constantly about her overexerting herself, but she had discovered that physical activity helped manage the restless energy that came with the final months of pregnancy. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said one morning as he found her in the garden, weeding between the rows of vegetables despite the early hour heat. "Least of all to me." "I'm not trying to prove anything," she replied, straightening with one hand pressed to her lower back. "I'm trying to be useful. This baby's going to come whether I sit in a chair all day or keep working. I'd rather be productive." The vegetables they had planted together in the spring had flourished beyond either of their expectations. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed their poles with eager abundance, and the herb garden had become a fragrant paradise that made even simple meals taste like celebrations. Lila had discovered that she possessed her mother's gift for coaxing life from the earth, and the evidence of that gift surrounded them in green profusion. But it was the wildflower patch that drew her attention most often. The seeds she had scattered that first hopeful morning had grown into a riot of color-purple lupines, yellow coreopsis, red Indian paintbrush, and white yarrow that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds in delightful abundance. Looking at them, she could measure the distance she had traveled from the frightened, shamed woman who had arrived at the ranch 4 months ago. The transformation was not lost on the neighbors either. Word of their marriage had spread through the mountain communities with the speed that news always traveled in sparsely populated areas. Some of the responses had been predictably judgmental whispered, comments about hasty weddings and questionable circumstances. But others had surprised her with their warmth and acceptance. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose ranch lay 10 miles to the west, had arrived one afternoon with a basket of baby clothes and a matter-of-fact manner that brooked no embarrassment. "Every child needs proper clothing," she had said, unpacking tiny gowns and blankets with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own. "These belong to my youngest, and they're too good to waste." "Mrs. Patterson, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just raise that baby with love and teach it right from wrong. That's all any of us can do." The Hendricks family from the next valley had sent their eldest son with an offer to help with the heavier ranch work as Lila's time drew near. Even crusty old Pete Morrison, who ran cattle on the far side of the mountain, had stopped by to offer his congratulations and share a bottle of whiskey with Cade in celebration of the marriage. "Takes a strong woman to make a go of it out here," he had said, nodding approvingly at Lila's obvious contentment. "And takes a wise man to recognize one when he sees her." But along with the acceptance came other, more troubling developments. Dr. Morrison had stopped by twice in recent weeks, ostensibly to check on Lila's condition, but clearly fishing for information about the circumstances of her marriage. His questions had a pointed quality that suggested someone was encouraging his curiosity. "Everything appears normal," he had said after his most recent examination, "though I confess surprise at how settled you seem, given the unusual circumstances of your situation." "What's unusual about a woman being happy in her marriage?" Lila had asked, her voice carrying an edge that made the doctor step back slightly. "Nothing, of course. Nothing at all. I simply meant, that is, the timing of events. The timing of events is our business, Dr. Morrison, Cade had interjected with quiet firmness. I trust you'll respect our privacy in that regard. More concerning had been the letter from her father that arrived the day after Dr. Morrison's second visit. It was the first communication she had received from him since leaving Cold Mercy, and its contents were as cold and judgmental as she had expected. Lila, she read aloud to Cade that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. I have been informed of your recent marriage and find myself deeply disturbed by the haste and circumstances of this union. While I cannot prevent what has already been done, I feel compelled to warn you that Mr. Whitmore has not abandoned his claims regarding the child you carry. He has consulted with legal authorities and may seek to challenge your marriage on grounds of fraud and deception. Cade's jaw tightened as she continued reading. Furthermore, questions have been raised about the propriety of your living arrangements prior to the wedding ceremony. Several members of my congregation have expressed concern that your marriage may have been contracted solely to avoid the legal consequences of immoral behavior. The man has quite an imagination, Cade said grimly. There's more. Lila's voice had grown steadier with anger. I feel it is my Christian duty to inform you that I cannot in good conscience acknowledge this marriage or any children that may result from it. You have made your choice, and you must live with the consequences. Do not expect support or recognition from your family in this matter. She folded the letter carefully, her hands remarkably steady, despite the emotional impact of her father's rejection. He's disowning me, officially and completely. Are you surprised? Lila considered the question seriously before answering. No. Disappointed, but not surprised. My father was always more concerned with appearances than with people, even when I was a child. I suppose I hoped that becoming a grandmother might soften him, but that was naive. His loss, Cade said simply, reaching for her hand. Any man who would disown his own daughter for choosing love over shame isn't much of a father to begin with. The words were comforting, but they couldn't entirely ease the sadness that came with having her fears confirmed. She was truly alone in the world now, except for the man beside her and the child growing within her. It was both terrifying and liberating, the knowledge that she had no safety net except what she and Cade built together. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. Active tonight, Cade observed, his eyes crinkling with the gentle humor she had come to love. Very active. I think this child is going to be a handful. Takes after its mother, then. The teasing comment was delivered with such obvious affection that Lila felt her melancholy lifting despite the weight of her father's rejection. This was her family now, this quiet, strong man who had shown her what real love looked like, and the child who would complete their small circle. But even as she treasured these peaceful moments, Lila could not shake the feeling that they were living in a brief calm before a storm. Thomas's threats, her father's warnings, the pointed questions from Dr. Morrison, all of these suggested that their carefully constructed new life was still vulnerable to outside interference. The feeling proved prophetic when a rider arrived the next morning with news that made Cade's face go pale with concern. Thomas Whitmore had returned to Cold Mercy, this time accompanied by a territorial judge and a marshal carrying legal documents that challenged the validity of their marriage. He's claiming fraud, the messenger explained, a young man who clearly relished being the bearer of dramatic news. Says you coerced Miss Mercer, Mrs. Rawlins, into marrying you to avoid facing charges for harboring a woman in immoral circumstances. Says the whole thing was a sham to cover up improper relations. That's ridiculous, Lila said, her voice sharp with indignation. Maybe so, Ma'am, but Judge Carmichael takes these things serious. He's ordered you both to appear in Cold Mercy tomorrow for a formal hearing. Says if you don't show, he'll issue a warrant for your arrest. As the messenger rode away, leaving them to absorb this new crisis, Lila felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. Just when she had found safety and happiness, Just when she had begun to believe that the worst was behind them, the past had reached out to drag her back into uncertainty. "What do we do?" she asked, hating the note of fear that had crept into her voice. Cade was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the mountains that ringed their valley like protective walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet determination she had heard the day he first brought her to the ranch. "We go to cold mercy," he said simply. "We tell the truth, and we fight for what's ours." The words were brave, but as Lila looked toward the town that had been so eager to cast her out, she wondered if the truth would be enough to protect the life they had built together. Tomorrow would bring the final test of whether love could truly triumph over the forces of shame and judgment that had ruled her life for so long. The courthouse in Cold Mercy had never seemed so imposing as it did on that sweltering August morning when Lila and Cade arrived to defend their marriage. The building, which normally served as a meeting hall for town functions, had been transformed into a formal court with Judge Carmichael's bench positioned beneath the large window that faced Main Street. Half the town seemed to have gathered for the proceedings, filling every available seat and lining the walls with the eager anticipation of spectators at a prize fight. Lila walked slowly up the courthouse steps, her hand resting on Cade's steady arm for support. At 8 months pregnant, every movement required careful consideration, but she held her head high as she passed through the crowd of familiar faces. Some watched with open hostility, others with curiosity, but a few like Mrs. Patterson and the Hendricks family offered encouraging nods that reminded her she was not entirely without allies. Thomas Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table with Attorney Brennan, his expression radiating the confidence of a man certain of victory. He had dressed for the occasion in his finest suit, every inch the successful businessman seeking justice against rural fraudsters. When Lila entered the room, his eyes fixed on her swollen figure with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Judge Carmichael was a stern-faced man in his 50s, appointed by the territorial government and known for his strict interpretation of the law. He called the proceedings to order with the sharp rap of his gavel, and the murmur of conversation died immediately. "This court is convened to hear the matter of Whitmore versus Rawlins," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Mr. Whitmore seeks to have the marriage between Mr. Cade Rawlins and the former Miss Lila Mercer declared invalid on grounds of fraud and coercion." Attorney Brennan rose smoothly to present his case, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, was engaged in legitimate business in Denver when he learned that the woman carrying his child had been essentially sold to Mr. Rawlins by her father. Rather than wait for Mr. Whitmore's return to properly address the situation, Mr. Rawlins took advantage of Miss Mercer's vulnerable condition to enter into a fraudulent marriage designed solely to prevent Mr. Whitmore from claiming his parental rights. The words painted Lila as a helpless victim and Cade as a scheming opportunist, reducing their love to a mere legal maneuver. She felt Cade's hand tighten on hers, but his expression remained calm as Brennan continued his attack. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Rawlins and Miss Mercer were living in immoral circumstances for months prior to their hasty wedding ceremony. Dr. Morrison will testify that he observed clear signs of intimate relations between the defendants, making their marriage nothing more than an attempt to legitimize sinful behavior." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this accusation, and Lila felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The lies came so easily to these men, wrapped in legal language that made slander sound like justice. "Mr. Whitmore seeks custody of his unborn child and compensation for the emotional distress caused by the defendant's deceptive actions," Brennan concluded. "We ask this court to declare the marriage void and restore my client's rightful position as father to the child in question." Judge Carmichael nodded gravely and turned to the defense table where Cade and Lila sat with the young lawyer they had managed to engage from a neighboring town. Samuel Crawford was barely out of law school, but he had the passionate idealism of youth and a genuine belief in justice that more experienced attorneys might have lost. "Mr. Crawford, you may present your defense." Crawford stood, his nervous energy evident as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, this case represents nothing more than the desperate attempt of a man who abandoned his responsibilities to reclaim what he discarded when it became inconvenient." Whitmore left Miss Mercer to face shame and hardship alone. Mr. Rawlins offered her protection, respect, and eventually his name in marriage union entered into freely and with genuine affection. The young lawyer's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his argument. "The marriage certificate is valid, properly executed by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls. Mrs. Rawlins will testify that she entered the union willingly, motivated by love rather than legal convenience. This court should not reward abandonment by punishing the good man who stepped forward when Mr. Whitmore failed in his duties." As Crawford spoke, Lila noticed movement near the back of the courtroom. Her father had entered quietly, his presence commanding immediate attention from those who recognized him. Reverend Isaiah Mercer walked slowly down the center aisle, his face grave as he took a seat in the front row. The sight of him sent a chill through her. Had he come to support Thomas's claims? To publicly disown her before the entire community? Judge Carmichael called for the first witness, and Dr. Morrison took the stand with obvious reluctance. Under Brennan's questioning, he testified about his visits to the ranch, carefully implying impropriety without making direct accusations that could be easily challenged. "In your professional opinion, Dr. Morrison," Brennan asked, "did Mrs. Rawlins appear to be a woman who had entered marriage freely, or one who might have been coerced by circumstances?" Before Dr. Morrison could answer, the courthouse bell began to toll not the regular hourly chime, but the urgent rhythm used to call the community together in times of crisis. The sound seemed to echo through the building like a divine judgment, demanding attention and bearing witness to the truth about to be revealed. Dr. Morrison's testimony faltered as the bell continued its urgent tolling, and Judge Carmichael frowned at the interruption. But before he could call for order, Lila felt a familiar tightening in her belly, different from the usual discomfort, sharper and more insistent. She gripped Cade's hand, her face going pale as understanding dawned. "The baby," she whispered, and the words seemed to carry through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Cade's chair scraped against the wooden floor as he stood immediately, his protective instincts overriding all legal protocols. "Your Honor, my wife needs medical attention." "Now see here," Thomas protested, rising from his seat with obvious irritation. "This is clearly a ploy to avoid." His words were cut short as Lila doubled over with a sharp cry, her hand pressed to her belly as another contraction seized her. The reality of the situation became immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom, and the legal proceedings suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the drama of impending birth. Dr. Morrison abandoned the witness stand without being dismissed, his professional instincts taking precedence over legal formalities. "We need to get her somewhere she can lie down," he said, moving quickly to Lila's side. "This baby's not waiting for your hearing to conclude." "She can't leave," Attorney Brennan insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The court must resolve this matter before." "The court," Judge Carmichael interrupted with surprising firmness, "will not interfere with the birth of a child. This hearing is suspended until further notice." As Cade swept Lila into his arms with gentle strength, preparing to carry her from the courthouse, an unexpected voice rose from the front row. "Wait." Reverend Isaiah Mercer stood slowly, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "Before you go, there are things that must be said, things this court needs to hear." Thomas turned eagerly toward the preacher, clearly expecting support for his cause. "Reverend Mercer, thank you for coming. I'm sure you'll help this court understand the true nature of—" "Be silent," Isaiah commanded with the authority that had silenced congregations for decades. "You forfeited any right to speak about my daughter when you abandoned her in her hour of need." The courthouse fell into absolute stillness, everyone straining to hear what the preacher would say next. Another contraction gripped Lila, but she managed to remain conscious as her father approached the bench. "Your Honor," Isaiah said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced projection, "I have come here today not to support Mr. Whitmore's claims, but to confess my own sins before this community and before God." He turned to face the packed courtroom, his eyes finding Lila's for the first time in months. "I stand before you as a man who preached love while showing none to his own child, who spoke of forgiveness while harboring judgment in his heart, who valued his reputation more than his daughter's welfare." Thomas started to protest, but Isaiah's raised hand silenced him immediately. "When my daughter needed me most, I cast her out like refuse," the preacher continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "I gave her to Mr. Rawlins not out of concern for her welfare, but to preserve my own standing in this community. I failed as a father and as a Christian." He moved closer to where Cade held Lila, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward them both. "But Cade Rawlins succeeded where I failed. He saw my daughter's worth when I could see only my own shame. He offered her safety when I offered only judgment. He gave her love when I gave her nothing but cold duty." Another contraction seized Lila, more intense than the last, and Cade shifted her carefully in his arms. "Reverend, we need to—" "One moment more," Isaiah said urgently. "Mr. Whitmore, you speak of rights and claims, but what claim does a man have who flees when faced with responsibility? What right to fatherhood belongs to someone who leaves a woman to bear shame alone?" He turned back to the judge, his voice gaining strength. "Your Honor, I have witnessed the marriage between my daughter and Cade Rawlins these past weeks. I have seen how he cares for her, how she has flourished under his protection. This is no fraud or deception, this is love, pure and simple. The kind of love I should have shown my daughter, but was too proud to give." The simple gold wedding band on Lila's finger caught the light streaming through the courthouse windows as another contraction racked her body. She looked at her father through tears of pain and unexpected hope, seeing for the first time in months the man who had raised her rather than the cold stranger who had cast her out. "I ask this court," Isaiah concluded, his voice now thick with emotion, "to recognize what I was too blind to see, that my daughter has found not just a husband, but a true partner. That the child she carries will be raised by parents who chose each other freely and love each other deeply." Judge Carmichael looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the community members who had witnessed this unexpected testimony. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of both legal authority and human compassion. "In light of the testimony presented and the immediate circumstances," he announced, "this court finds no evidence of fraud or coercion in the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Rawlins. The union is declared valid in all respects, and Mr. Whitmore's petition is denied." Thomas shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is outrageous. You can't—" "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice cutting through Thomas's protests, "this court warns Mr. Whitmore that any further harassment of the Rawlins family will result in legal consequences. Your parental claims, such as they were, ended when you abandoned your responsibilities." As if in celebration of the verdict, Lila's body announced that the baby would wait no longer. Her cry of pain mixed with relief echoed through the courthouse, and Cade didn't wait for further permission before carrying her toward the door. "Dr. Morrison," he called over his shoulder, "we'll need your help." "Right behind you," the doctor replied, gathering his medical bag with practiced efficiency. As they left the courthouse, Lila caught one last glimpse of Thomas's defeated face and her father's expression of profound regret mixed with hope for redemption. The legal battle was over, but the most important part of her journey was just beginning, the moment when she would finally hold her child in her arms, free from shame and surrounded by love. 6 hours later, as the first stars appeared in the mountain sky, Elizabeth Sarah Rawlins took her first breath in the bedroom, where her mother had found refuge and love. She was perfect in every way that matter-written tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a voice that announced her arrival with indignant vigor. Dr. Morrison, who had delivered half the babies in cold mercy, declared her the healthiest infant he had seen in months. Cade held his daughter with the reverent care of a man who understood he was holding a miracle. His large, work-roughened hands looked impossibly gentle, cradling the tiny bundle, and when Elizabeth wrapped her miniature fingers around his thumb, Lila saw tears glisten in his dark eyes. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect." "She looks like you," Lila said, though she knew it was probably too early to make such determinations. What she really meant was that Elizabeth already showed signs of the quiet strength that defined the man who would raise her as his own daughter. The handmade cradle that had waited so patiently in the corner of their room finally served its purpose, lined with soft blankets that Mrs. Patterson had brought during the long afternoon of labor. Elizabeth settled into it, as if she had always belonged there, which, Lila reflected, she had. The days that followed blurred together in the sweet exhaustion that comes with new parenthood. Cade proved to be a devoted father, rising for nighttime feedings without complaint and learning to change diapers with the same careful attention he brought to every task. He would stand by the cradle for long minutes just watching Elizabeth sleep, and Lila often caught him talking to her in low, gentle tones about the ranch, the animals, and the life she would grow up knowing. "She'll need to learn to ride before she can properly walk," he told Elizabeth one morning as he changed her diaper with practiced efficiency. "Can't live on a ranch without knowing horses. And we'll teach her about the garden too, how to make things grow, how to be patient with the seasons." Lila watched these interactions with a contentment so complete it sometimes took her breath away. This was what family looked like, not the cold duty she had known in her father's house, but the warm partnership she and Cade had built together. Elizabeth would grow up understanding that love was shown through daily kindnesses, through steadfast presence, through choosing to stay when staying was difficult. 3 weeks after Elizabeth's birth, her grandfather came calling. Reverend Isaiah Mercer arrived on a Sunday afternoon, his hands twisting his hat brim as he stood awkwardly on the front porch. He looked older than Lila remembered, as if the weight of his regrets had aged him more than mere time. "I was wondering," he said carefully, "if I might meet my granddaughter." Lila and Cade exchanged glances, both remembering the cold stranger who had given her away like unwanted property. But they also remembered the broken man who had stood before the courthouse and confessed his failures to the entire community. "She's sleeping," Lila said, stepping aside to let him enter. "But you're welcome to see her." Isaiah followed them to the bedroom where Elizabeth lay in her cradle, one tiny fist pressed to her cheek in the complete abandon of infant slumber. For several minutes, he simply stood there, his eyes drinking in every detail of the granddaughter he had almost lost through his own pride. "She's perfect," he whispered finally, echoing Cade's words from that first night. "Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold her?" Lila offered, and the hope that flickered in her father's eyes reminded her of the man who had once read her bedtime stories and taught her to fish in the creek behind the parsonage. Isaiah held Elizabeth with the careful reverence of a man who understood he was being given an undeserved gift. When she stirred and opened her eyes, fixing him with that unfocused but intense gaze that newborns possessed, his composure finally cracked. "I'm sorry," he said, the words directed at Elizabeth but meant for them all. "I'm so sorry for everything, for failing your mother when she needed me most, for valuing my pride over my daughter's welfare, for almost missing the chance to know you." "We all make mistakes, Reverend," Cade said quietly. "What matters is what we do next." What Isaiah did next was surprising in its humility. He began visiting regularly, not as the righteous preacher dispensing judgment, but as a grandfather eager to be part of his granddaughter's life. He helped with the garden harvest, shared stories of Lila's mother that brought tears and laughter in equal measure, and gradually rebuilt the relationship with his daughter that his pride had nearly destroyed. Thomas Whitmore, meanwhile, had left Cold Mercy immediately after the court hearing and had not been heard from since. Attorney Brennan had returned to Denver, presumably to find clients with more promising cases. The town itself seemed to have collectively decided that the Rawlins family deserved the same respect accorded to any other established ranch family in the valley. On a crisp October morning, when Elizabeth was 2 months old and the aspen trees had turned the mountainsides to gold, Lila stood in her wildflower garden holding her daughter. The flowers had grown beyond her wildest expectations, creating a natural meadow that attracted butterflies and birds in delightful abundance. Elizabeth seemed fascinated by the dancing butterflies, her eyes tracking their movement with the intense concentration only babies could achieve. "Look there, little one," Lila whispered, pointing to a monarch butterfly that had landed on a nearby stem. "Beautiful things can grow from the smallest beginnings." Cade emerged from the barn where he had been tending to a horse with a minor injury, and the sight of his 2 girls surrounded by flowers made him stop in his tracks. This was the family he had never dared hope for, the love that had grown from what others saw as punishment into something more precious than gold. "What are you thinking about?" Lila asked as he joined them in the garden. "Just counting my blessings," he replied, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Thinking about how sometimes the best things come when you least expect them." Elizabeth chose that moment to take her first tentative steps, wobbling between her parents with the determined concentration of someone tackling a great adventure. As she collapsed into Cade's waiting arms with a delighted giggle, Lila realized that this was what redemption looked like, not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of countless small choices to love, to stay, to build something beautiful together. The woman who had once been handed over as punishment had become the queen of her own small kingdom, ruling not through power, but through the quiet sovereignty of a life built on love, respect, and the knowledge that some gifts come disguised as burdens until we learn to see them clearly.